Stoic Wisdom. Ancient Lessons for Modern Resilience. Book by Nancy Sherman. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Contents. Lesson 1 The Great Stoic Revival. Lesson 2 Who were the Stoics? Lesson 3 Finding Calm. Lesson 4 Managing Your Emotions. Lesson 5 Stoic Grit and Resilience. Lesson 1 The Great Stoic Revival. A New Zen. Stoicism has made a comeback, and a huge one at that. There are Stoic self-help books, digests of Stoic quotes, websites with Stoic wisdom to kickstart your day, podcasts, broadcasts, and online crash courses, some to learn how to become manly, others to become calm, some to learn to meditate Roman style, others to practice abstention, some to learn to take more control, others to take less. Tim Ferriss, the well-known author of The 4-Hour Workweek and popular Silicon Valley thought leader and podcast host, touts Stoicism as the ideal philosophy for entrepreneurs. It's the right operating system, as he puts it, to help train people who dream big to learn when and how to contain their egos. Stoicism has become the new Zen. It's a philosophical practice for reducing stress and cultivating goodness. Beyond the online Stoic community is Stoicon, an international, annual meetup to help learners of all walks incorporate Stoic practices into their daily lives. The fervor has spread to the alt-right, too, with Stoic enthusiasts championing the great works of Western civilization as a bastion of whiteness and masculinity. It's fair to say that Stoicism has become the darling of many. But why? For a start, it's an accessible philosophy with pithy wisdom. Among its Roman authors and sympathizers were emperors and political advisors, the likes of Cicero, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, who had power and class and the gift of letters. In Seneca's case, his most famous student was Nero, in need of daily lessons in controlling rage and anger. The political climate then was ripe for Stoicism, a philosophy of calm in the face of imperial power and intrigue. There are parallels today. But Stoicism never was just for the elite. It was also for enslaved persons, such as Epictetus, who in a remarkable irony of history went on to inspire an emperor, Marcus Aurelius, to write his own Stoic meditations. The meditations were meant for Marcus's eyes only, private reflections written at nightfall in a tent along the Danube during the Germanic campaigns. The nighttime journaling was to remind himself, as emperor and general, of the importance of humility and reason-based virtue in the face of his unlimited power. Marcus embraced Epictetus's message that we have power over our own minds and not outside events. Our well-being hangs on our judgments about what affects us and not on brute, uninterpreted objects or events. We are, by default, interpreters of the world. There is no unfiltered experience. In this the Stoics were prescient. But why is Stoicism the new Zen of the West now? In part, the need for finding calm is ever pressing in Western culture. In the startup tech world, work weeks can be manic, the lead-up to new funding rounds even tougher, and the pressure to design products that are both user-friendly and examples of smart engineering leads to stress and burnout at all levels. Life hacking, or creating shortcuts for living efficiently and well, has gained a new attraction. Stoicism appeals to many as offering time-honored workarounds. For the alt-right, it has the additional badge of being a philosophy of dead white men. The COVID-19 pandemic added a new layer of anxiety for everyone as people faced new stresses from social isolation, job losses, massive death, and basic fear. The pandemic made it abundantly clear that we need ways of preparing ourselves, emotionally and psychologically, for worst-case scenarios. In short, we are hungry for ways of dialing down anxiety and tempering despair. There is a call for self-help and for self-calm. For those looking for counsel and wisdom in the traditional Western canon, Stoicism's Greco-Roman roots give it a seal of approval. Its recognizable imprint in much of the Western thought that followed makes it all the more approachable. On top of that, it's a philosophy, at least the Roman school of Stoicism, that is and always has been not just contemplated, but practiced. Its pivotal idea is not to get rid of self, as Zen Buddhism teaches, but to strengthen self-mastery, while still recognizing its limits. Practicing Stoicism was for the ancients, and is now for so many moderns, a way to build resilience. Its methods are psychological but also philosophical and normative, tied to living a life of virtue and character. The goal is inner strength, woven through and through with goodness rooted in reason. The merger is unbeatable. Ancient virtue ethics meets modern life management skills. It is hard not to be attracted to some aspects of Stoicism, especially its core idea of strengthening self-control while abiding by hard limits set by forces outside ourselves. The applications are ubiquitous. You don't have to be Seneca in the court of Nero, or the U.S. Navy pilot and Vietnam-era prisoner of war James B. Stockdale, who embraced Epictetus's philosophy as a survival method during 7 years in captivity. The challenges of pushing the boundaries of personal control are part of all of our lives, whether as a parent trying to figure out how to influence a grown child yet worried that too much control will alienate, or as a life hacker wanting to beat death while realizing that it's an inflated attachment to self that is probably driving the urge. In much of life's pursuits, we want to have more control, don't quite know the limits, want to push hard until they're reached, and then want to accept what must be with equanimity. In short, we want control where we can have control, and want to accept limits in due course so we don't succumb to anger or crippling disappointment. We want to be masters of our fate, captains of our soul, to paraphrase the Stoic-inflected poem Invictus by English poet William Ernest Henley. But the challenge to the Stoics, both ancient and modern followers, is to figure out just what is subject to our mastery and finesse. If, as Stoics, we draw the boundaries too narrowly, Stoicism looks like a way of playing it safe, a way of being in charge because so much is left beyond our will, in the hands of luck or the universe. If others draw the line for us, an appeal to Stoicism can overburden us as individuals and create a myth of an indomitable will that can and should do battle whatever the conditions and systemic structures, however adverse. It leaves out the collective work of changing those systemic structures. The image of the sage tortured on the rack who still can thrive is one that Aristotle rejects as outrageous and that orthodox Stoics resuscitate as the paragon of virtue sufficient for happiness. But most of us, and Stockdale certainly included, experience distress when we push against boundaries to no avail, or undermine the goodwill of those we're trying to influence. Unimpeded exercise of cultivated or natural abilities brings pleasure. The reverse is also true. We experience pain when, despite our best efforts, we are thwarted, even if we see growth opportunities down the line. In short, resilience as invincibility is a misguided notion. Epictetus, one of our sources, often appeals to the notion of resilience, as well as to the idea of moral training as a kind of athletic sport, where you are always ready to pick yourself up and get back in the ring. Willpower and grit know no limits. But Epictetus is a hyperbolizer. And he makes too little mention of the social supports that can sustain us or fail us. Other Stoic writers do a better job of appealing to our connectedness and vulnerability to love and loss. A lesser-known Stoic writer, Hierocles, visualizes a series of extended, concentric circles with the self at the center. To be at home in the world requires striving to bring the outermost circles toward the center. The Scottish Enlightenment philosopher Adam Smith, himself influenced by the Stoics, would go on to call that identification process changing places in fancy, honed through exercises in empathy and imagination. Marcus Aurelius paints a more visceral image in his Meditations. Picture a dismembered hand and head lying apart from the rest of the human trunk. That's what man makes of himself when he cuts himself off from the world of which he is a part. Marcus was writing while on a military campaign. Presumably, he had in mind intimate killing and dismemberment that he had seen on the battlefield earlier in the day. Body parts can't function cut off from the organic whole to which they belong. Similarly, we can't thrive cut off from the political and social whole of which we are a part. The implications are critical in a world witnessing the rise of corrosive forms of nationalism and rampant hatred fed by tribalism. The pandemic has made clear that we are a global community, like it or not. The reduction of fear and risk is essential not just for our own survival, but for the welfare of distant others with whom we are connected by virus, food supplies, transportation, medicine, and technology. The Stoics were our first serious cosmopolitans. It is not surprising. They are of a political world that had begun to extend its borders beyond the small Greek city-state or polis. The Roman Empire advanced into vast swaths of land of many continents. The actual coinage of the term cosmopolitan predates the Stoics. Diogenes the Cynic, the 4th century BCE immediate Stoic predecessor from Sinope, likely near Corinth, Greece, famously replied, when asked where he came from, "I am a citizen of the world, a cosmopolis." Zeno of Citium, Cyprus c. 335 BCE, the founder of the Stoic school, developed the idea and taught that social and political engagement in that global universe is necessary for flourishing. We share common reason and depend upon bonds of social support and cooperation to live a good life. What the ancient Stoics meant by sharing in the reason of the cosmos is likely not ours. But one thing the Stoic notion of cosmopolitanism suggests is that resilience is not a matter of just doing your very best, with individual effort and stamina the marker of survival. Quite to the contrary, being at home in the world, another pivotal Stoic notion which we will explore, is a matter of being connected to others who invest in you and who sustain and support your goodness. That richer Stoic story of cultivating virtue by extending circles outward needs to be part of a critical guide of how to thrive as a Stoic. That's part of the story I shall tell. This book is a field guide for a credible Stoic practical philosophy. It corrects distortions in recent popularizations of ancient Stoicism and argues for Stoic tenets and practices worth following. It offers a kind of app for how to live a good life. It explores the reason for Stoicism's revival in the tech world, in the military, in the alt-right, in self-help circles, and even in psychotherapy. It explores its appeal for all of us, in all walks around the world, as we search for calm in the face of the pandemic of a century. A preview of lessons. The Roman Stoics engaged in philosophy as practical discourse. They taught, and wrote letters and meditations, as a way of giving counsel. They gave lessons for the art of living, as they would put it. In that spirit, here is a synopsis of Stoic lessons. In Lesson 2, I introduce readers to the Stoics, who they were, their ideas in historical context, and their legacy. The arc of Stoic influence is long and strong. Stoic DNA is embedded in Judaism and Christianity, medieval and Renaissance thought, Enlightenment philosophy, and American intellectual thought, as in the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson refashioned the Stoic notion of self-mastery with a notion of self-reliance meant to challenge convention through authenticity and a commonality of mind disclosed in nature. The Stoic themes of inner mastery dependent on sociality and nature resonate throughout history. I can only gesture at some of the intellectual trends in this book, but the key is that the Stoics are a bridge between the ancient and modern worlds. They sit at the cusp of the first millennium, and they usher in the Judeo-Christian era and the Western philosophies that follow. What's more important to bear in mind in reading this book is that the Roman Stoics were quintessentially public philosophers. They advocated a practice of philosophy. Stoicism was a household philosophy, taught and practiced. That is precisely the appeal of Stoicism today, a philosophy for everyday living that is not the stuff of the ivory tower. But popularizations bring exaggeration and distortion. It did then. The Stoics were famous hyperbolaizers, out to convince young men, their primary target, of the attractions of their school. History may be repeating itself in the ways in which Stoicism is misrepresented today. Tracking that pattern, then and now, is a critical feature of this book. In our attraction to Stoicism, are we picking up a balanced picture of Stoic teachings? In Lesson 3, I turn to the question of Stoic practice. How does it work and what are the Stoic techniques of self-control? Are the Stoics control freaks? Or do they give us healthy ways of regulating our complicated emotional lives? The Stoics are inveterate neologists, eager to coin terms that aren't tainted by old ways of thinking. The aim is to carve up the inner and outer world at different joints from their predecessors. The practical upshot of the new conceptual map is that it pinpoints areas for greater self-control and techniques for strengthening that control. Monitoring the impressions and evaluations that we assent to as we take in the world will be key. But equally important will be rehearsing in advance the kinds of losses and failures we may face in order to cushion the shock of what's unanticipated. Separating striving from successful outcome will also be key for finding the calm that comes from knowing the limits of our control. Rehearsal and exposure to stresses bear striking resemblances to contemporary methods of trauma relief, though in today's settings, exposure techniques are used more often after the fact, therapeutically, rather than as prophylaxis, before. Here, the Stoics have something important to teach us about how to train ourselves to diminish physical and psychological stress before we are overwhelmed by it. How do the Stoics counsel us in managing our emotions? And which emotions? In short, does Stoic practice allow you to have emotional skin in the game? This is the subject of Lesson 4. The Stoics have a highly sophisticated and prescient account of emotions as cognitive. And they posit various levels of emotional experience, from near autonomic responses to cultivated emotions expressive of virtue and wisdom. A critical question to ask as we examine emotional regulation is if the Stoics can teach us how to limit stress in life without flattening the feelings that give life meaning, whether as lovers, caregivers, teachers, dancers, theater-goers, novel readers, or engaged citizens. How do you hold on to interest, commitment, motivation, and stick-to-itiveness without the kind of passion that can occasionally unhinge you? I'll raise these questions as we think about emotions in general, and specifically about anger and grief. Many Stoic adherents are attracted to a program of self-mastery, rooted in hard endurance and grit. Stoicism has become shorthand for a time-honored way to build tough resilience. But as I argue in Lesson 5, resilience is a notion that is easily distorted. It's one thing to adapt well in the face of trauma and adversity. It's another to over-idealize the power of an individual to endure and tough it out whatever the resources. More critically, that notion of rugged self-reliance misuses ancient Stoicism. While Epictetus, one of our sources, often talks of invincibility, he is a popularizer, known for his epigrammatic bullets, and not our best representative of more nuanced Stoic thought. I explore Stoic techniques for building resilience in light of contemporary notions of resilience. Most current psychological studies no longer view the resilient individual as invulnerable, but rather look at the social and cultural protective factors that promote risk and adversity adaptation. This, too, is what some of the Stoics suggest we train: protection from risk and adversity, adaptiveness, not invincibility. If a modern Stoic model of resilience is to be plausible and not simply attractive to those wanting to tough it out at all costs, then it needs to be a model for healthy resilience. Otherwise, Stoic enthusiasts are advocating models that pose potentially serious mental health risks. As I have already suggested, the social dimension that is part of our well-being is central to Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. It is also a recurrent theme in many of Seneca's writings, in his letters and essays, and most vividly, in his tragic play, Hercules Furens, Hercules Raging. Here, Seneca showcases the idea that even Herculean courage requires the healing overtures of a father's soft touch and a dear friend's compassion to show him what, in his compulsion for heroic action, he can't show himself. Reliance on another is critical for even a Hercules. Stoicism has long shaped the culture of the military, as I detail in Lesson 6, drawing on my own experience teaching at military institutions. For those who serve, to suck it up and truck on is just to be stoic. For many in the service academies, Stoicism has an implicit capital S, with a strong nod to Greco-Roman teachings. The writings of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius are standardly taught at the military schools in the United States and abroad. A naval admiral, venerated American hero, and military educator, James B. Stockdale famously credited his survival for 7.5 years as the senior prisoner of war in North Vietnam's famed Hanoi Hilton to internalizing Epictetus's handbook. Yet Stoic doctrine is in tension with what is increasingly recognized in military circles as a psychological cost of war and a hazard of being a morally conscientious fighter, that is, moral injury. Moral injury is an extreme form of moral distress. Some of its symptoms overlap with those of post-traumatic stress, but its trigger is typically not overwhelming life threat but a sense of having committed, suffered, or witnessed moral transgressions. So, for example, a soldier may kill a young child in a car at a collateral incident at a checkpoint when the car, approaching a military base, failed to stop after repeated warnings. The soldier, himself a father, is racked by overwhelming guilt and shame, not lessened by the fact that the shooting was permissible, in accordance with just war rules and the specific rules of engagement. Can the Stoics leave room for moral injury in a training bent on eliminating stress? If they can, do they also tell us how to learn from moral injury and grow? In Lesson 6, I argue yes to both questions. I show how the Stoics leave space for the possibility of good moral distress and healing through self-compassion. That is critical if injury is to open the way for moral growth and the calm of repair. In Lesson 7, I ask, Why is Silicon Valley so smitten by Stoicism? If Stoicism teaches the wisdom of humility and knowing the limits of self-mastery, then how does it resonate with those who want to push the boundaries of control to the point of hacking life to beat death? Are Stoic-inspired life hacks always about me, or are they sometimes about better ways to see others without bias and irrational fear? Can instant global connection through Twitter or other social media itself be a modern Stoic collective life hack for facing fears bound up with racism? Relatedly, how does the modern Stoic answer worries about misappropriation of Greco-Roman dead white men to construct social institutions that are whiter and that exclude women, minorities, and other marginalized groups? Were ancient Stoic philosophers themselves misogynistic in their writings? In Lesson 8, I compare Stoic and Eastern meditation. The Roman Stoics meditated at the end of each day. Seneca details his own practices. Marcus wrote his journal at the end of a day of battle. The meditative tone is moral: strengthen reason-based virtue and analyze what is in accord with nature, let go of reputation, wealth, and honor, place ultimate value in the cultivation of your goodness, practice gratitude and humility. These are paths to equanimity. Eastern meditation practices, various forms of which I have practiced, offer less moral suasion. Vedic meditation is a practice of calming the mind by a gentle anchoring in a repeated mantra. It's not about virtue or goodness or moral perfection. Indeed, it's not discursive practice. The idea is not to talk or scold, but to quiet the babble. Buddhism emphasizes a notion of emptiness by letting go of illusions associated with the ego. Given that meditation is part of the appeal of the Stoic revival, just what does that meditation practice look like? If the mantras are not chants of OM, but moral maxims, then how do those maxims create calm when their very point is to remind us of our shortcomings so that we can resolve to do better? Is moralizing ever a viable way to find equanimity? In this lesson, I reflect on my own meditative practices, Eastern and Stoic, and those of others who draw on Stoicism in their professional lives. I draw some conclusions about Stoic life in Lesson 9. If you still want to be a Stoic, can you be a psychologically healthy modern Stoic? Can a modern Stoic support and be supported within a life of vibrant social connections? Is Stoic resilience something more than individual rugged grit and endurance? I argue yes, throughout this book, to all of these questions, but it will require going beyond some of the public caricature of Stoicism and drawing on the richer reality of Stoic texts. It also requires a reckoning with the Stoics on enslavement. Epictetus was an enslaved Roman who turned to inward freedom because outward freedom wasn't possible. Seneca wasn't enslaved, though he was a political exile. He pleaded a powerful case for the humane treatment of enslaved Romans, but his motives were complicated and often self-serving. The weave of human connection isn't always benign or grounded in respect, even if that is the promise. Texts are framed by history, and the reality of lived lives are morally messier than the pure aspirations expressed in writing. Still, those texts and their aspirations give us an abundance of wise counsel, including prototypes of life hacks for how to find healthy calm in a world swirling with widespread fear and anxiety. The lessons are about virtue writ large, not just about me and managing desire or risk, but about us, and tools we can use together to serve a higher goal. The Stoics are exhorters. And at their best, they exhort us to rise to our potential through reason, cooperation, and selflessness. Note on terminology. Texts are framed by history, and so, too, language and terms. Lived lives are messy, but so too is moving in and out of time periods. Stoicism applies to us, not as ancient Greeks or Romans, but as moderns, living in our own times, with our own challenges and honest reckoning with our past. Our past includes the enslavement of African Americans and our present the legacy of that enslavement. The Black Lives Matter movement, reignited in the wake of George Floyd's death in the summer of 2020, reopened a national conversation about race, including the language we use to talk about it and the conditions of marginalization. Slave, to my ear, suggests that this is a person's whole and enduring identity. Slavery, in turn, conceals the institutions and agency of those who are the enslavers. I'm uncomfortable with both terms, and have avoided using them in my own voice, whether I'm talking about modern or ancient times. The Greeks and Romans bequeath a history of enslavement to us. Persons were enslaved by birth, by capture in war, and by sales at auctions. But the Stoics famously distance themselves from institutional enslavement. They turn real enslavement to a condition of the soul. Philo captures the Stoic paradox with a pair of treatises: Every good man is free, and another, unfortunately lost, Every bad man is a slave. The powerful and free swindler, scoundrel, and enslaver can be enslaved. The bought and beaten enslaved person can be free. It's a retreat that distances morality from social and political reality. Wisdom requires learning from the past, but also avoiding its sins and errors. Only then can we move forward morally, politically, and socially. And so, in my own writing, I have used the term enslaved persons and institutions of enslavement to signal that enslavement is a political and social condition imposed on a person. We need constant reminders that all persons share in humanity. If they are turned into mere tools, property, or objects, as in the case of torture and enslavement, it is imposed from outside. In a similar vein, I refer to Philo, not as Philo Judaeus, but as Philo or Philo of Alexandria. Judaeus swamps his identity. That said, I use texts translated by others whose deep scholarship I am indebted to and respect. If they translate a text from Seneca or Epictetus or others using slave or slavery, I preserve that. I have no interest in eviscerating the past and its record. We need to see it in order to know what a better future for all of humanity might look like. The enduring Stoic promise is to empower us in our common humanity. We need to remember that as we turn to Stoicism for guidance. Lesson 2. Who were the Stoics? The story of the Stoics begins with Socrates, 470 to 399 BCE. His simple style of life, gathering of disciples in the marketplace, and his fabled death all establish him as the progenitor of the Stoics. His image and influence loom large in Stoic thought. The Socrates most of us know is the creation of his pupil, Plato. Socrates was an oral philosopher only, he left behind no written texts. In his early dialogues, Plato paints a vibrant portrait of his teacher as a philosophical innovator committed to the health of the soul, the psyche, and practices that will promote it. Socrates' famous method is to cross-examine those he meets in the marketplace in order to see if their sincerely held beliefs about justice, courage, temperance, piety, and the like hold up to scrutiny. Conventional views inevitably come up short, and Socratic inquiry ends in impasse. But the process of examining a lived life, through the bite and sting of Socratic cross-examination, elenchus, established a powerful model for honest scrutiny about how to live a good life. The Stoics perpetuate that model. Socratic practice is embodied in a persona. That persona becomes central in the diffusion of Socrates' influence. Socrates is the epitome of self-restraint. We learn from Plato that he could go for long periods without food or sleep, he could endure the cold, he wore only a single cloak in both winter and summer. He could take in good food and wine at drinking parties without getting either sated or drunk. Via these stories about Socrates, the ideal of self-mastery becomes essential to the Stoic story of how to achieve inner freedom. The turn inward is also helped by the fact that Socrates was, by most accounts, no handsome man. He cut an odd appearance and manner. The snub nose and flaring nostrils were hardly his fault. But he used what nature endowed to cultivate an image of strangeness. Aristophanes satirizes him in The Clouds. You waddle in the streets and cast your eyes sideways, and go barefoot, enduring a great deal of suffering, but put on a hoity-toity expression. If Socrates' strange appearance was for many contemporary Athenians hard to stomach and a painful critique of their own ordinary conventions, for generations that followed it inspired an image of real beauty being inner and not outer. The goodness of conventional goods and the inheritances that come with luck and good looks were challenged by Socrates' very person. This challenge becomes central in Socratic irony. It's spoofed again, now by Xenophon in his comic portrait. Socrates' pushed-in nose and flaring nostrils are what's really beautiful, not as fashion model noses go, but as a prototype of a more efficient vent. In being wide open and not pointing to the ground, those nostrils allow him to better catch scents from all around. And 2, if beauty is not just a matter of shapely contour but function, then his bulging eyes are really more beautiful than most because Socrates can see peripherally and not only straight ahead. The Socratic nose-eye combo is simply unbeatable. A snub nose doesn't put a barricade between the eyes but allows for unobstructed vision that has a full 180-degree range. Socratic irony is a subtler and more serious matter in Plato's hands. Socrates famously admits in the Apology that although he is wise, his knowledge is actually quite limited. Or as Plato has him say with ironic twist, "I do not think I know what I do not know." That famous untangling of the Delphic god's oracle that no one was wiser than Socrates is what launches Socrates on his quest to examine claims of knowledge, his own and that of others. The irony isn't feigned ignorance, but a sincere belief that he doesn't have real wisdom, the kind of gold that boys like Alcibiades and other followers are so eager to find in him. Still, and this is important for the Stoic legacy, Socratic irony comes with a tacit endorsement of a philosophical method that inverts meaning. Ignorance becomes a form of knowledge. Ugliness becomes a superior form of beauty. Words keep their familiar sense but change what they stand for. This swap becomes part of the Stoics' philosophical method as they begin to relabel experience and our evaluation of it. What we thought to be good may be false goods, or at least lesser ones, and other goods more deserving of the name. Stoic training is, in no small part, a re-education of attitudes and emotions so that experience lines up with these new evaluations. Moreover, while Socrates acknowledged that he didn't have flat-out ignorance, he also didn't think that the kind of knowledge he or others had could guarantee that a rational and happy life was attainable. The Stoics don't take Socrates' resignation at face value. Nature must have so constructed us to be able to attain the knowledge necessary for happiness, even if it is only a rare sage, one who rises only as often as the phoenix, who can achieve that kind of infallible knowledge. Even if Socrates is the model for many Stoics of a Stoic sage, it is not in his embrace of ignorance as wisdom. Diogenes the Cynic is the pivot between Socrates and the Stoics. The Stoics liked to publicize a line of succession that went back to Socrates. Socrates taught Antisthenes. Antisthenes taught Diogenes. Diogenes taught Crates. Crates taught Zeno. And Zeno was the first head of the Stoa. But it was Diogenes whose influence after Socrates was the greatest, and the most colorful. In the Stoic hagiography, he is often part of a duo with Socrates as quasi-sages. Diogenes, like Socrates, subscribed to a simple life of minimalist needs. But he's an eccentric and exhibitionist. And his irreverent but austere asceticism made for political street theater. When he couldn't secure a cottage, he took an earthenware tub as his homeless home and parked it in the heart of the Athenian agora. In summer, he rolled the tub over hot sands, and in winter, he hugged cold statues, in order to inure himself to hardship. Following the Cynic rule on dress, he folded his cloak, his sole garment, so it could double as a bedroll and accessorized with only a staff and a wallet to carry his belongings. He wandered streets, famously lighting his lamp in daylight in search for an honest man. Deface the coinage became his signature slogan, shorthand for flout political convention. He was a countercultural figure, a yippie of his day. His anti-money sloganeering brings to mind Abbie Hoffman's famous targeting of Wall Street in 1967 by dropping hundreds of dollar bills from the galleries of the New York Stock Exchange, effectively closing down the trading floor as brokers scampered for the bills. When asked where he came from, Diogenes famously replied that he was a citizen of the universe, and likely meant that he was at home nowhere except in the universe. He was a citizen unbound by the borders of a city, a citizen of the cosmos, hence, a cosmopolitan, the origin of the term. He spurned marriage as a convention and the business of power and politics. With other cynics, he championed unisex clothing and liberally showing off body parts, not only in the gym. He condemned hypocrisy, whether in those who insisted honest men were superior to the rich while themselves envying the rich, or in those who would sacrifice to the gods for health while gorging like gluttons at the sacrificial feasts. It is the cynic's general break from regressive norms of marriage, gender, dress, and money that opens the way for a Stoic notion of moral authority rooted not in convention, but in following nature and its purported rational order. Inner virtue, under the Stoics, becomes virtue in accord with nature. Diogenes spouted black humor zingers to drive home the point that psychic health depended on inner freedom and self-mastery. His witty repartee is a biographer's dream. And our biographer, Diogenes Laertius, probably living sometime around 250 CE, revels in the retelling. It is a retelling, for he probably was copying and quoting wholesale out of library manuscripts which ended up preserving what otherwise would have been lost to history. Still, Diogenes's gossip can be juicy and makes for a good read in the absence of other biographies. And so we are obliged to turn to him. He tells us that as an enslaved person and up for sale, Diogenes the cynic was asked about his skills. He wasn't really joking when he told the auctioneer that he could rule men and to give notice to potential buyers that they might be getting someone who was the real ruler of the house. Real mastery was inner, whether you were an enslaved person or an enslaver. He called demagogues the lackeys of the people, and misguided those who thought they could clean up their acts just by a little ritual purification. Don't you know that you can no more get rid of errors of conduct by sprinklings than you can of mistakes in grammar? An ignorant rich man he dubbed a sheep with the golden fleece. Legend has it that upon being asked by Philip II who he was and why he was being brought before him as a captive, Diogenes brazenly told the king to his face, "I am a spy upon your insatiable greed." Impressed by his bravado, Philip freed him. On another occasion, upon seeing temple officials hauling away a petty thief for stealing a bowl, he quipped, "The great thieves are leading away the little thief." Diogenes was uninhibited, shameless as a dog, hence his moniker, the cynic, kunikos, meaning dog-like. His Socrates gone mad. The gadfly of mad comedy. But like Socrates' stinging cross-examination, Diogenes's comic jibes were meant to sting and shock listeners into questioning their norms. Few Stoics can mimic the antics of Diogenes. But the substance of his teachings, questioning the authority of culture and custom, adapting to circumstance and the vagaries of fortune, finding happiness in self-mastery in highly adverse circumstances, being a global citizen, inverting meanings and accenting the new inversions with hyperbole, all become Stoic inheritances. So too is teaching by a strenuous mental training that parallels and pairs with athletic training of the body, hard toil, steady striving, incremental building of endurance and strength. With those weapons, as Diogenes taught, you are capable of outright victory over anything. The Stoics let up on some of the harsh austerity of cynicism. But they develop Diogenes's seed idea of cosmopolitanism, and the notion that self-mastery is supported by affiliation in a community that extends to all humans. We are social, as Aristotle insisted. The Stoics don't relinquish that insight, though it gets interpreted in new ways. Zeno, 334 to 262 BCE, was a student of Diogenes' student, Crates. And it is Zeno, a native of Citium or Cyprus, who founds the Stoic school in Athens. The Zenoians soon came to be called the Stoics, after the Stoa Poikile, a painted, or better, fresco-lined colonnade, in the central Athenian agora where followers, the men from the Stoa, met to talk philosophy and get exposure to the new conceptual tools and lingo Zeno was developing. Philosophy had been a public affair since the time of Socrates, its topics abuzz in walks, gardens, gymnasia, and the agora. Stoicism continued the tradition. Stoicism wasn't the only school that had followers. Aristotle's influence in Athens was waning. Aristotle himself had gone to Macedonia in 343 BCE to teach Alexander, who would become Alexander the Great. With Alexander's Hellenization of the Mediterranean, and excitement about all matters Greek, foreigners, like Zeno, came to Athens to do philosophy and set up shop. Others, some Greek and some from more distant shores, also set up schools, with doctrines and loyal adherents, such as those who came to be the skeptics, largely taking on the Stoics and their orthodox doctrines, and Epicureans and more. Philosophy at this time was still a street subject, but it came to be specialized and far more technical, its schools narrowly philosophical in a way difficult to imagine in the time of Aristotle, whose research program at the Lyceum reflected who he was: a practicing scientist, a marine biologist, as well as philosopher. The breadth of his knowledge and academic competence was truly remarkable. It is no surprise that casual readers don't know Zeno's work in the way that they may know the Roman Stoics, such as Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, or Seneca. Zeno's work comes to us only in snippets told and retold by editors and expositors. Still, we are fortunate that among our own contemporary scholars, Malcolm Schofield has engaged in breathtaking, sleuth-like work in assembling a jigsaw puzzle of pieces from disparate sources to recreate a picture of Zeno's political tract, The Republic. In that treatise, Zeno lays the foundations for an ideal cosmopolitan city of the human and divine, a critical reply, of sorts, to Plato's Republic that mixes the communal theme of Plato's city with the Cynic belief that the norms of morality are grounded not in convention, but in reason and the rational order of nature. The universe is the home of that city, a city that knows no borders or walls and is administered by a providential nature that is beneficent, kind, well-disposed to humans. Political authority becomes vested not in the state, but in reason, the logos of the universe. This Stoic ideal of a cosmic city is a reminder to modern Stoics that the Stoic founder tied the ideal of self-regulation to a system of global social cooperation. However sketchy the picture, the core idea is that universal reason unites us, and a community based on that reason, with respect for persons in virtue of shared reason, must be nurtured and cultivated. We depend on that community for our own strength. Any Stoic who severs self-reliance from a sense of belonging to that community is missing an essential element of Stoic doctrine. Working through Zeno's Republic is not something, thankfully, we need to do here. But it's important to stress that its themes of looking at things from the point of view of the whole and not our individual selves, of making politics not local but global in a habitat where humans and gods can mingle, get taken up by later authors, from political leaders, such as Marcus Aurelius, to moral theorists, such as Immanuel Kant. Our deep sociality is not a new theme for the ancients. We are by nature social and political animals, Aristotle famously said. The Stoics' departure point is in neither restricting community to those who happen to be our neighbors nor the excellence of practical reason and its functioning to human nature. Gods are in our community. Zeno is no eccentric in the mold of Diogenes. But his biography, again as retold by Diogenes Laertius, has comic notes. Apparently Zeno knew that he was destined to study philosophy once the oracle told him that the way to achieve the best life was to take on the complexion of the dead. To a student who talked too much, he was said to have told him his ears had slid down and merged in his tongue. To another who denied that a sage could fall in love, he told him that if he really thought that, no one was a more hapless youth than he. The tip is that teaching, then and now, has always required some wit to keep an audience entertained. Zeno systematized 3 areas of philosophy that came to be central in Greek Stoic thought: logic, physics, and ethics. It is ethics that is our concern, and ethics as the ancients understood it, how to live a flourishing life with virtue or character excellence at its center. Virtue, for all the ancients, is guided by the perfection of our cognitive capacities, and especially, our practical reason. In pioneering work, Zeno lays out one of the most sophisticated and prescient accounts of the cognitive basis of emotions in the history of philosophy. Despite the popular idea of Stoicism as a wooden philosophy that bowdlerizes emotions from human experience, Zeno never argued that we should get rid of all emotions, but rather that we should manage those emotions that are debilitating and that lead to uncontrollable cravings, fears, or distress. Much of the shock and awe of Stoic management of emotions comes with later Roman Stoic writers, especially Epictetus. Though Zeno is less of a practitioner than a theoretician, when he sketches certain emotions, we know them by his concrete descriptions. Grief can be a heaviness that weighs us down. Annoyance can come with a sense of feeling cooped up, a kind of emotional stenosis, a constriction, an obstruction that makes it hard for things to pass through us or let us move beyond them. Distress is a feeling that can come from over-ruminating. Distraction colors grief in a way that distorts judgment and prevents us from seeing the situation as a whole, in a balanced way. These are emotions that are palpable, described by a Stoic who seems to know just how they feel. We'll have much more to say about emotions, what they are and how to regulate them. But to appreciate Zeno is to appreciate, in part, a philosopher who understands how intimately virtue is tied to our emotions, and thus, why we are owed a sophisticated account of emotions and their regulation as the underbelly of virtue training. Also critical to Zeno's legacy is the refinement of Socrates' view of the sufficiency of virtue for happiness. For the Stoics, that comes to mean that all other goods are indifferents, though as Zeno taught, this doesn't mean that they are indifferent in our lives, they are just not proper components of our happiness. To select or reject them wisely becomes a matter of living in accord with nature. How to understand that cryptic phrase sets in place an agenda for generations to come, focused on natural law and its place in human governance. Cleanthus, 331 to 232 BCE, of Assos, modern Western Turkey, is Zeno's colleague at the Stoa and successor as Stoic head. Apparently, he wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. As Diogenes Laertius tells us, his renown was more for brawn than brain. A pugilist as a youth, and impoverished upon arriving in Athens, he supported his daytime activity of studying philosophy by a nighttime shift of drawing water from a local well. Built like an ox, he stood up to his peers' jibes about his intellect by insisting he alone was strong enough to carry the load of Zeno. Few of his writings remain, though the titles of his works suggest a wide range of subjects in ethics that become central to Stoic thought on what is fitting, on impulse, on gratitude, on envy, love, honor, and deliberation, to mention just some of them. His tenure at the school was shadowed by the third and final head of the Stoa. In industry, Chrysippus surpassed everyone, writes Diogenes Laertius. But Chrysippus of Soli, in southern Anatolia, also surpassed most in brilliance and creativity. Along with Zeno, he is responsible for the enormous influence of Stoic thought on most of Western philosophy. His output was voluminous. We have more than 705 titles, and included works in logic and fallacies, grammatical mistakes and blunders in speech and ordinary language, ethical works on the virtues, character states, and arguments against pleasure as the ultimate good. He even weighed in on art conservation in Against the Touching Up of Paintings. He trained early on as a long-distance runner, and stamina and endurance were part of his intellectual profile as well. For many, early Stoicism has come to mean the philosophy of Chrysippus. He figures heavily in Cicero's account of the Stoics on emotions and the final good, and his arguments show rigor, sophistication, and acumen. The scanty snippets of Greek Stoic writings contrast with the volumes we have from the Roman Stoics. And it is these that have been read and reread, and refashioned in some degree, as part of the European intellectual tradition of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, and now, the current Stoic revival. Some of the more negative Stoic views about the unruliness of emotions have become encrusted parts of modern thought. We owe much to Cicero, 106 to 43 BCE, for the transmission of Greek Stoic ideas to the Roman world. Not himself a Stoic, he was nonetheless sympathetic to many of its views. He labored to translate into accessible Latin some of the more arcane Greek terms that were part of the Stoic machinery, and was committed to making Stoicism, and in general Greek philosophy, accessible to a non-Greek reading lay audience. Many will know the rough details of his public life. Of humble origins, he rose meteorically through the ranks of the Senate to become consul at the young age of 43. He was a well-known Roman political orator, military leader, and ally to Pompey. He devoted his energies to philosophical writing at the end of his political career, after Caesar's assassination and while in hiding from his own future assassins, Antony and the other triumvirs. Philosophical writing became profoundly personal after the death of his beloved daughter, Tullia, in childbirth. In his grief, he turned to the Stoics, though, as we shall see, in Tusculan disputations, he argued with the Stoics as much as swallowed their tonics. His works on moral ends and on duties were to become indispensable in European political thought for their statements of Stoic positions. Seneca the Younger, the Seneca most of us know, 3 BCE 65 CE, was from an eminent family that groomed him early on for a political career. A sickly youth felled by several bouts of tuberculosis that resulted in a suicide attempt in adolescence, Seneca knew setbacks and rebounds from an early age. Trained in rhetoric and philosophy, Seneca's father was a famous teacher of rhetoric. The young Seneca was a prized tutee of the Stoic Attalus. By then, in part thanks to Cicero, philosophy had gained considerable credibility in elite Roman public life, even as an alternative to politics. But many mixed philosophy and politics, and in particular Stoicism and public office, however awkward the fit of Stoicism's more austere Cynic teachings with the decadence of imperial Rome. The tension is a recurrent theme in Seneca's lived life and writing, craving and managing craving, whether of oysters and mushrooms, anger and drink, power and well-connectedness. Roman life, especially for those in power, gave wide ambit for the need to rein in the passions. Seneca is, in many ways, the flawed protagonist of this book. He is an important source for modern Stoicism, and one we should read more often. He is full of nuance, even if not without hypocrisy. He may offer fewer pithy quotes than Epictetus, but he is a masterful writer with dazzling rhetorical skill. And he is a moral aspirant living in a complicated, messy world. He yearns for self-freedom in an ecosystem larger than himself. Indeed, he's a pragmatic philosopher who knows well the muddy waters of politics and power. He swims in those currents, as Nero's tutor, political advisor, and speechwriter. Nero, the 16-year-old boy emperor, didn't necessarily want to repeat the reign of Caligula, but he didn't hold back when the dynastic succession was threatened. Seneca thought he could help him and restrain his more wanton ways. But as history tells us, he wasn't so successful, ultimately. A few historical details should suffice. Seneca came to the court through the interventions of young Nero's mother, Agrippina, who sought him out as a tutor with the most famed reputation in the empire for rhetoric and public speaking. She became his patron, bringing him out of exile in Corsica, 41 CE, where her husband Claudius had banished him for 8 years for his alleged adultery with his niece, Julia Livilla. Getting Nero closer to the throne through the powerful pen of Seneca was part of Agrippina's motive. Seneca's own motives then became keeping the boy in power, even though it soon involved keeping the mother out, who had fallen out of favor with her son. There is no shortage of intrigue in this palace where Seneca lurks in the background. There was the poisoning of Claudius's biological son, Britannicus, when he became of age to take the throne, a plot of which Seneca, as a palace insider, was likely aware. Though Agrippina was his benefactor in getting him to the palace, he showed her limited gratitude in defending Nero's murder of her in a speech which records suggest didn't go down well with all. What comes around goes around, and while Nero's anger may have been restrained on occasion, it was by no means ever managed. Seneca must have been well aware of the threat against his own life, given his repeated attempts to retire from public life in his later years and his general preoccupation in his writings in those years, in the letters, once he did retire, with issues of mortality and the transience of power. In 65 CE Nero orders Seneca's suicide on charges that he was involved in the Pisonian plot to have the emperor assassinated. This mini-bio reminds us that when Seneca writes about clemency, grief, anger, or constancy or rails against the evils of materialism, he writes as no moral or political naif. He knows the pull of wealth and power and the perils of trying to escape it under the eye of a watchful and vengeful tyrant. He takes up his pen and well-trained Stoic stance, in part, to calm his own fears about political power and to aspire to something purer. As he often says, he writes from the perspective never of a sage, but from that of the moral doctor who is at once a patient, in need of Stoic medicine and healing. His famed nighttime meditations are meant to quiet himself and give moral suasion. But the mirror sometimes turns outward, and his pointed finger aimed at less urbane folk who may have cast an insult his way. He rose from a modest equestrian background in the provinces, and never, like some other Stoics in Rome, stayed clear of Nero's inner circle. Once in it and wanting out, he opted for his own suicide rather than being forced to it. In this regard, he writes not as an Epictetus, who was a freed but formerly enslaved person, living well outside the halls of power and poor all his life, with no aspiration to write polished prose that would earn him renown through the ages. In short, Seneca is a pragmatist who has been in the political trenches, suffered its glory and infamy, and yearns for some personal moral change and a reset of what counts as glory. That, at least, is a way to begin to read some of the moral essays, letters, and tragedies which I take up in these pages. His writings are important for our own politically troubled and tumultuous times. The list of Roman philosophers typically omits Musonius Rufus, 30-1012 CE, a Roman senator and Stoic who taught at various times in Rome. The omission is a pity, for he is the teacher of Epictetus, probably the most oft-quoted Stoic, and Musonius's own writings are themselves important records of Roman Stoic thought. Part of the reason that he has fallen into recent obscurity is that selections from his work have not been anthologized. But he was well known in antiquity as a major figure. The Christian theologian Origen paired him with Socrates as a moral exemplar. The historian Tacitus pictures his followers as a stern, serious bunch, among them statesmen and politicians, who, as one scholar writing in 1896 put it, were waiting quietly through the wild riot of the court in Nero's time till their turn might come. Turning to Stoic lessons in finding calm while preparing for better political times might be a prescription for our own times. Indeed, Musonius was willing to work with the politicians if through their voice and influence they could promote greater public improvement. Of those who weren't politicians, they came because they were serious about the state of their soul. Epictetus was among them. Musonius wrote tracts that should be read by more modern Stoics, such as should daughters and sons get the same education, and that women too should do philosophy. His debt to Plato's Republic on the equality of women can be traced. And he seems to be following closely the theme of cleanness in his lost work, on the fact that the same excellence, or virtue, belongs to a man and a woman. While Musonius's feminism is dampened at times by concessions to Roman custom, his commitment to the excellences of a flourishing life as the same for all humans is decidedly Stoic. Epictetus, 50 to 130 CE, was enslaved. He was a native of Phrygia, a Greek-speaking province in Anatolia. He was acquired, and later emancipated, by Epictetus, a wealthy freedman and secretary of Nero. While still enslaved, he studied philosophy in Rome with Musonius Rufus and once freed, established his own school in Nicopolis on the Adriatic coast of western Greece. Like Socrates, whose style Epictetus may have modeled, he was exclusively an oral philosopher whose audience was primarily boys between the ages of 18 and 23. We know his work through his student Arrian, who ghostwrote the detailed teachings in what come to us as the Discourses, for extant of the original 8 volumes, and in the popularized short manual, the Enchiridion, or the Handbook. The writings are informal and are penned in the common Greek that Epictetus would have used to lecture. The suffering of an enslaved Roman permeates Epictetus's writing. He was a cripple, as a result of disease, according to some accounts, and according to others, as a result of beatings under enslavement. Even as a freed person, he chose an ascetic life, with a pallet and a rush mat as his furnishings. Enslavement leaves indelible marks on Epictetus's teaching. Real freedom is inner freedom that can be sustained even in bondage. He may not be a Stoic on the rack, but physical pain and adversity guide him. Part of the popular appeal of his writings is that they are brimming with pithy and quotable epigrams sprinkled generously with hyperbole. Though a popularizer, his views are rooted in the systemic doctrines and arguments of earlier Stoics. Epictetus goes in for shock and awe tactics in part to wake up his listeners, young men on the cusp of adulthood, hooked on material goods or fearful of loss and irreversible bad luck. The style is meant to entertain and exhort, and set out a program for coaching discipline. Indeed, his work is replete with tests of mental drills in worst-case scenarios, what a person would do in a hard case. Counterfactual reactions to tough cases become rehearsals for real life. They are a form of virtual training. The tests are tough, and so was his love. Here he took a lesson from his teacher Rufus. Epictetus tells us, "It is not easy to gain the attention of young men who are soft, for you cannot get hold of soft cheese with a hook, but the naturally gifted, even if you turn them away, hold all the more firmly to reason." Rufus, for the most part, tried to turn them away, but the gifted ones couldn't be easily repelled. Discipline in disciples requires testing firmness, just as in cheese. In an irony of history, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, 121 to 180 CE, turns to an enslaved Roman, namely Epictetus, for enlightenment. Written as reflections to himself, what has come down to us as the Meditations are essentially diary entries, written in Greek, never intended for teaching or distribution. They are rambling meditative notes jotted down at the end of a long day of battle during the Germanic campaigns while Marcus was camped along the Danube, 170 to 174 CE. A breviary, of sorts, they reflect a ruler taking counsel with himself, with compassionate reminders about how to reckon with the possibility of lost power and title, how not to get seduced by gold and glitter, how to find satisfaction in simplicity. A massive golden effigy of himself would likely have been wheeled out by day as the battalions lined up. At night, he needed to remind himself of the vanity of it all. Soft-peddling the contradictions of power and abstinence was not his game. That's Seneca's style. Despite his power, Marcus is a humble supplicant, aware of the Heraclitean flux that takes what it gives, and our connected status with each other and God through shared universal reason. In popularized modern Stoicism, Marcus is the ideal of masculine strength and self-reliance, epitomized by the monumental, equestrian statue whose image is front and center on many Stoic websites and books. But Marcus is no lone horseman. Nor would he have us think that we are either. His battlefield imagery, as I noted in the previous lesson, underscores the need for social connection and the perils of isolation. We are incomplete without others and are interdependent parts of a whole. In the wake of a pandemic, his views about global interconnection are more relevant than we ever could have imagined. His view of interdependence reflects Stoic doctrine that human and cosmic nature are parts of the same whole and allies. We are members of a community that unites humans and our better selves, or gods. Our fulfillment is in working out that collaboration. Philo of Alexandria, c. 15 BCE 50 CE, is not an oft-mentioned actor in the Stoic cast of characters. However, his work represents an important aspect of Hellenization in the Jewish world and, specifically, an attempt to interpret the Old Testament in light of Greek Stoic teachings. Philo draws on Stoic teachings about layered emotional experience to explain how Sarah, who on his reading of Genesis is on the cusp of being a sage, could laugh when God tells her she is going to have a child at the ripe old age of 90. If laughter is an emotional disturbance, then as a near sage, she should be able to control it a bit better. But she did, in a way, argues Philo, for she only laughed within herself. It was a nervous laugh, we could say. Once she caught it, she was ready to be filled with joy and divine laughter. And so, too, Abraham, when he goes to Sarah's grave to mourn and weep, catches himself before he gives in to uncontrolled wailing. He was only going to weep, but caught himself before the onset. And so, in these Stoic interpretations of Genesis, Philo provides lessons on how emotions can be controlled and regulated. Pre-emotions can be nipped in the bud before they become full-blown ordinary emotions. And ordinary emotions can become cultivated, good, and virtuous emotional states befitting a sage, or in this case, a biblical matriarch and patriarch. Philo draws from other ancient sources, including Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Here, Philo mimes Aristotle closely on our social nature. Nature has made man not like the solitary beasts but highly social like the gregarious animals that graze together, so that he might live not for himself alone, but for his father and mother and brothers and wife and children and his other relations and his friends and his fellow citizens and his tribesmen and his country and those of the same race and all men. It is only at the end of the passage that Philo tags on a distinctively Stoic note that the boundary of social connection extends outward beyond the polis to all of humanity. The Stoics had a major influence on Christian thought. Like Philo, early Christians also turned to the Stoic notion of pre-emotions in thinking about how to control emotions and avoid temptation. With some twists and turns and concept blurring to suit a new religious agenda, they made Stoic pre-emotions your own fault, and advanced the idea that bad thoughts now accompany the body's emotional arousals, its tears and nervous shudders, its shrinkings and swellings. In this way they could allow for intermediate degrees of sin. With Christianity also comes the idea that bad angels or the devil could induce the bodily agitation that leads to temptation. Much later, the Dutch humanist and theologian Erasmus, 1466–1536, will refashion Epictetus's idea of a handbook in writing his own handbook, or Enchiridion of a Christian Knight. Written at the turn of the 16th century, it's a book intended for the lay reader, instructs Erasmus, to prepare knights for war against the Turks. As a handbook to carry into battle, it takes pain more in exhorting than in teaching, not with threatening epistles but with a method taught in few words that shows clearly the manner of living. Missionizing the gospel is the cause or purpose of the knight's wars. The conduct of war, teaches Erasmus, hangs on chivalrous behavior. And those lessons in chivalry have a better chance of sticking, he tells his readers, if they are delivered with punch and brevity. That said, his handbook is brief, but it has little of Epictetus's punch. Still, it is Stoic in many of its doctrines, as in the view, again, of sudden pre-emotions or first motions that don't necessarily impugn a wise warrior. A perfect wise man should lack ordinary motions, even if he still is subject to those first motions that come as impressions that he may experience but not act on. The sage's example is meant to set a standard for warriors of all ranks. Emotional restraint, whether outlined in a code of chivalry, as in Erasmus's era, or in just war theory, in our times, is a permanent feature of the conduct of war. It is also crucial in the conduct of policing, as we shall see in later lessons. The overall impact of Stoicism on later European moral and political thought is too wide and deep to summarize here. The Stoics, and especially the Roman Stoics, were read, reread, cited, and quoted by most who considered themselves educated. The natural law tradition in Christianity, for example, and through to the modern secular works of Grotius and Pufendorf in the 16th and 17th centuries, owes an especially strong debt to Stoicism. Montaigne in the mid-17th century draws from many of the ancients, but notably the Stoics, in exhorting readers to endure hardship and penury and develop the virtues necessary to defy pain. It's our opinions that give value to things, not the things themselves, he pens with a clear nod to the Stoics. Montaigne is a colorful writer and his Stoic advocacy is, at best, a mixed bag. He appeals to the Stoics in their view that vices are all alike, despite their variety. But drink, he then insists, shouldn't be on that list. Well, again, maybe it should be for the Germans who drink almost indifferently of all wines with delight. But why should a Frenchman give up wine, given his sophisticated palate? If drunkenness is a vice, he sums up, then it is less malicious and hurtful than the others, which almost all, more directly jostle public society. Whatever Stoicism is for Montaigne, it is not undiluted asceticism. In his correspondence with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, René Descartes, 1596–1650, turns to Seneca to paint a portrait of the Stoic sage and the happy life. He counsels the princess to cultivate a firm and constant resolution to carry out whatever reason recommends without being diverted by passion or appetite. What impedes happiness is desire, regret and repentance. Still, Descartes adapts Stoic tenets to modern principles, showing how faith and Christian religion, and not only natural reason, must enter in this new modern account. He also famously ushers in the doubt and fallibilism of the modern era. It is not necessary that our reason be free from error, a conscience testifying to resolution and best judgment suffices. So here we have Stoicism propelled into modernity through a model that includes guidance from a monotheistic God and human fallibilism in place of wisdom that never errs. Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, is undoubtedly the philosopher who develops in the most original and revolutionary way the Stoic seed idea of the moral law as inseparable from our rational natures. The view is revolutionary in that it now is autonomous human reason, free of the pushes and pulls of nature or divine guidance, that is the foundation of our morality. Still, the idea of a shared universal reason across all persons is decidedly Stoic. Kant's famous idea that all persons are due respect in virtue of their common humanity, as ends in themselves in a kingdom or realm of ends, is a direct descendant of the Stoic notion of sharing humanity in a cosmopolitan moral and political order. Kant, like many of the moderns, exploits the Stoic view that emotions can be excessive, hard to curb, or pathological as Kant says, and, as a result, unreliable moral motivators. Acting from duty and not emotion becomes a signature Kantian theme. But it's an oversimplified picture of Kant's view of the role of emotions in morality. He tells us that emotions help us do what duty alone cannot do, whether it's recognizing others' needs through sympathy, or showing a face of human kindness in ministering to others. They are a garment that dresses virtue to advantage, and so we have a moral duty to make them allies of duty. Some emotions, says Kant, are more responsive to reason than others. They are practical emotions and bear a striking resemblance to what the Stoics call the good emotions cultivated with full virtue. That said, Kant never embraced the Stoic view that all emotions are cognitive. He rejected it. But he wasn't alone among moderns in hiving off desire and emotion from reason. The Stoic view of emotions got sidelined historically. That's all the more reason to turn to Stoic texts now for insight into how emotions are and can be intelligent. The legacy of the Stoics obviously does not stop with Kant and the rational Enlightenment. It continues, as I suggested in the previous lesson, with Emerson, and before that, with the American Founding Fathers. Jefferson read the Roman Stoics. So, too, did Washington. What they didn't read, they absorbed. Ancient Stoic virtue was in the air then, and it is now. Thank you for watching the Learner's Library. Please like, comment, and share. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon for more amazing audiobooks. Lesson 3. Finding calm. Stoicism in the time of a pandemic. I am writing in the midst of a raging pandemic. We are under siege. When it will end is hard to predict. But one thing is certain for me, it is a time to test the full promise of Stoicism. COVID-19 has lurched us into worldwide war against an invisible enemy for which we have little armor. I have written about war for over 3 decades as a non-combatant. But this is a war in which we are all combatants with an enemy. We are in this war together, the global community that the Cynics and the Stoics augured. We are interlocking pieces of a larger puzzle, in terms of protection and social behavior, enlightened leadership and clear messaging, financial markets, travel, supply chains, and crucially, testing, treatment, and the race to develop an effective and safe vaccine that can be equitably distributed. We want outcomes, but day to day we want ways to lower our anxiety as we worry about exposure to the virus, how to break out of loneliness, the vulnerability of healthcare workers and others on the front lines, the limits of access to hospitals, and the availability of life-saving equipment. We face our mortality squarely in a way many of us have never done before. It is a moment, if not to be stoic, to use stoic tools wisely. We do what we can to be prepared. The public message from the chief infectious disease doctor of the National Institutes of Health, Anthony Fauci, is that preparation has to be strategic. Fauci, with his plain-speaking Brooklyn accent, is a consummate communicator, who, not unlike Epictetus, knows he has to reach a lay public with memes that catch. When you are dealing with an infectious disease, you always have that metaphor that people talk about. That Wayne Gretzky, he doesn't go where the puck is, he's going where the puck is going to be. Well, we want to be where the infection is going to be, as well as where it is now. That is, we need now to be acting as if we are already facing the future. We have to be proactive, not just reactive. We have to anticipate. Pre-rehearsal, anticipation, learning how to dwell in advance, vividly imagining future evils as if now present are key to the Stoic approach of mitigating anxiety. Know the enemy you might be fighting. Don't be caught off guard. Applying these tools to the COVID-19 scenario, run simulations, understand the potential trajectory of a pandemic, and then heed the warnings. The Trump administration's Department of Health and Human Services actually ran such a simulation from January to August 2019, codenamed Crimson Contagion. The warnings were not heeded. In Stoic terms, there were extensive high-level pre-rehearsal exercises, but they were not taken seriously by those in power. The bottom line is that we failed to be prepared at both an individual and systemic level. A pandemic is a colossal crisis. It is hard to anticipate something of its magnitude and hard to coordinate an enduring effective global response. Still, one lesson it has taught is that surviving is a coordinated community project. Yet part of the popular appeal of Stoicism, especially in the online community, is in its treasure trove of lessons for self-sufficiency. Here's popular advice from Epictetus. Yes, my nose is running. And what have you hands for, then? Is it not that you may wipe your nose? Epictetus's surface point is, don't complain. Some put the stress note on self-reliance. Take care of wiping your own nose and don't wait for someone else to do it for you. Many generalize the point as a univocal Stoic theme that is all-purpose. But human self-sufficiency, on any honest conception, is relational, dependent at all levels on support from those whose help we often don't acknowledge or whose dignity we don't always properly respect. The notion of interconnectedness has deep Stoic roots, as deep as any themes of self-reliance. Marcus Aurelius puts it this way: beings endowed with reason, constituted for one fellowship of cooperation, are in their separate bodies analogous to the several members of the body in individual organisms. The idea in this will come home to you more if you say to yourself, I am a member of the system made of rational beings. California Governor Gavin Newsom, in his early shelter-in-place order to all state residents, put forth a message that echoes not just Marcus's sentiment but words: a state as large as ours, a nation-state, is many parts, but at the end of the day, we're one body. There's a mutuality, there's a recognition of our interdependence. He went on to say that we have moral duties anchored in our sociality. The lessons in this chapter are about Stoic techniques for mitigating anxiety. But Stoic insistence that we are socially interdependent will always be in the picture, as foreground or background. We are woven together by a common bond, with scarcely one thing foreign to another, Marcus writes, telegraphing Zeno's image of a cosmic city. Our preparedness to face the present and future depends on our own will and the will of others in coordinated, well-informed, and cooperative efforts. A more stable happiness. Still, it is hard to square the Stoic idea of social connectedness with their view that our vulnerability rests in things precisely outside our own virtue. The Stoic promise is to stabilize happiness through stable and reliable good character. That, too, was what the Stoics' great intellectual predecessor Aristotle was aiming for. But Aristotle insisted that good character alone was not enough for happiness. We need, in addition, resources, opportunities, means, and friends for exercising virtue in the world. Otherwise, as Aristotle put it, happiness would be compatible with passively being asleep for the rest of your life and with the greatest sufferings and misfortunes. Yet if happiness is virtuous activity and thus depends on things outside your control both for its exercise and full promise on luck, children who don't predecease you, good political leadership, and more, then as Aristotle himself admits, you entrust to chance what is greatest and finest, and that would be a defective arrangement. Still, to deny common sense and hold that you can be happy tortured on the rack, or lose some 13 sons, as Priam supposedly did during the Trojan War, without suffering a reversal of happiness, is pushing matters too far. And so Aristotle, it seems, had an unstable position. Happiness included both inner and outer goods. But just how to order them in a good life so that things outside your control don't derail your happiness was never fully resolved. Aristotle likely held that the matter couldn't be formally resolved. The decision rests with perception. We discern the particulars and take up matters case by case. We settle with how things are for the most part. It is foolish, he insisted, to look for the kind of precision in ethical theory that you would demand from the demonstrative proofs of a mathematician. But this didn't stop the Stoics from wanting more precision and brighter stripes. At very least, they wanted to secure happiness and tranquility for the fully virtuous and provide guidance for a path of progress. If it required forging new concepts and coining new terms, so be it. Clunky machinery wasn't an obstacle if the end goal was tranquility. External goods, the Stoics go on to argue, are categorically different kinds of goods from virtue. In fact, they are not real goods. Here, the Stoics appeal to Socrates, who argued that virtue alone is necessary and sufficient for happiness. Possessing such things as good health, stable and sufficient income, good friends and family, enlightened political institutions and communities, social esteem and respect, all these are not themselves part of happiness, the Stoics teach. They grant common sense and say these are things that, in general, we are naturally attracted to as human beings. They are preferred. Their opposites are things that, in general, we naturally avoid. They are dispreferred. But they insist that their presence or absence can't make or break happiness. They are not just externals. They are indifferents, they do not make a difference to happiness positively or negatively. The rub, as we shall see, is that they still play a substantive role in our lives. Indeed, virtue involves wisely selecting or rejecting them. The view is challenging, no less in ancient times than now. But one thing crucial to remember is that the term indifference, adiaphora, does not mean indifference. We are by birth and breeding neither indifferent to these goods or bads, nor should we harden ourselves to become so. Still, learning to live in a Stoic way requires fundamental recalibration of values. In particular, we need to learn behaviorally and not just intellectually that preferring or dispreferring goods or bads involves going for them or avoiding them in a way that isn't filled with restless yearning or panicky aversion. So not only do the Stoics have a different valuation system for what we might loosely call inner and outer goods, they also carve out a distinctive kind of approach and avoidance behavior that is meant to inculcate calm. We go for things without sticky, acquisitive attitudes. We reject things without fearful avoidance or anxious dread. Learning how to cultivate those new attitudes is part of Stoic training. And the striving critical to stabilizing that new value scheme is itself a Stoic way of life. So while the sage may be too exalted a model, the human turned divine, the sage arrived where she is through strategies for minimizing what's outside her control. And those are strategies, the Stoics teach, for all of us to adopt. Some things are up to us, assent to impressions. Still, what do we say about our clutch on life, or fear that our children might predecease us, or worry about a pandemic and a death toll that has taken more American lives than lost in battle in all of World War II? What do we control when we act with disciplined Stoic self-control? What do we let go of? Stoic self-control begins by drawing a line between our psychological faculties and what lies outside. Epictetus famously opens the Enchiridion this way: some things in the world are up to us, while others are not. Up to us are our faculties of judgment, motivation, desire, and aversion, in short, everything that is our own doing. Not up to us are our body and property, our reputations, and our official positions, in short, everything that is not our own doing. Many of us would protest right off the bat at where the line is drawn. Even if we can't fully avoid disease, penury, ignominy, loss of career or office, many of us can do some things some of the time to protect our health, material means, and so on. Epictetus grants that. But at some point, he argues, our armor and efforts, even that of the most privileged of us, will be no match for natural or human-made misfortune. That is Epictetus's core claim: we are all hostages of fortune in some way or other. Fine. We can grant him that. But we still might object that there is no hard line between controlling what is outside and what is inside. What's inside is vulnerable. Our capacity for judgment might be impaired by traumatic brain injuries or an aging brain, our cravings not in line with what we want, our fears pathological phobias rooted in psychological syndromes we wish we didn't have. Equally, there are epistemic biases. What we see may be tainted by implicit bias, and what we judge to be the case may be less our doing than the product of privileged standpoints and access. This is, of course, a modern view of the psyche and of knowledge. The Stoic view, by contrast, is radically volitional. And their claim is that the range of our willpower is expansive and its work empowering. With effort and choice we can turn our gaze inward to monitor stubborn patterns of attention. Through a modern Stoic lens, these might include cognitive or epistemic biases. I explore this application later. The locus of control on the Stoic view is our assent to impressions, or how things seem to us from the sensory input from outside and from within. Assent is the mechanism by which we tacitly say yea or nay to that input. It is the moment of basic control in judgment, motivation, desire, or aversion. So we may assent to a perceived insult as an evil that is distressing, or to disease as a perceived threat to be feared, or wealth as a perceived good to be desired and acquired. Each of these is an evaluative judgment, an acceptance that what appears is a good or a bad. In the case of evaluative judgments that are emotions, such as anger or fear, the evaluations are umphy. They engage us effectively and impel us, through impulses or hormai, to action. They are motivational. Horm is the cognate of our word hormone, and like that organic substance, it stimulates action. But it does so through the mediation of the mind. Seneca explains it this way: anger is undoubtedly set in motion by an impression received of a wrong. But does it follow immediately on the impression and break out without any involvement of the mind? Or, is some assent by the mind required for it to be set in motion? Our view is that it undertakes nothing on its own, but only with the mind's approval. Emotion is thus a kind of voluntary action. Through assent we implicitly frame and grasp the world propositionally and act on the resulting opinions or judgments. Emotions involve agency. Epictetus insists that with agency comes responsibility. It is not things themselves that trouble people, but their opinions about things. So whenever we are frustrated, or troubled, or pained, let us never hold anyone responsible except ourselves, meaning our own opinions. The idea is intuitive. We are inveterate interpreters at the most basic level of perception, seeing a penny, to take a simple example, as having three-dimensional depth when we really only see its two-dimensional face. We wear lenses of all sorts to sort and shape, and construct and categorize the world, and so, too, when it comes to categorizing goods and bads and how they affect our happiness. We always see and assess from what philosophers call an epistemic standpoint. As we said, we are not always free spontaneously to choose those standpoints. How we see may be the result of others' impositions, sometimes invisible, hidden persuaders, whether through the work of advertising agencies or social bots corrupting an election. How we see or interpret situations can also be the result of systemic and profound forms of domination. So, a woman's crippling sense of shame as a rape victim may be someone else's opinion that she has internalized. The work of patriarchy and shaming runs deep. Similarly, a young altar boy's fear of a pedophilic priest's continued assaults may get muted by the priest's sacred robes and his avuncular role at the Sunday family table. The inner world can be a socialized construct. And it isn't always an enlightened place for freedom or peace. Yet it may be a place of retreat when external forces give few other options. The young boy finds safety in his mind, even if through psychological dissociation. Subordinated or in captivity, we push our will to the limit. This is Epictetus's stance. A person enslaved and in bondage can still find inner freedom. It is what so inspired U.S. Navy senior POW James Stockdale in his 7.5 years of imprisonment, 2.5 years of which were in solitary confinement, in the Hanoi Hilton in North Vietnam. Epictetus's handbook was his salvation. Stockdale and I met several times and talked about the torture he endured. He came to embody for me what it was to live as a Stoic in the most extreme conditions of deprivation. Epictetus is politically disenfranchised. If there is any freedom, it has to come from within. That is his political reality, or at least, it is the formative conditions of his early life. His Stoicism is a response to it. The situation is different for other Stoics. Seneca becomes a public servant par excellence. He is politically enfranchised, powerful, and in the most elite inner circle as Nero's minister. But he wasn't always in public favor. Recall his exile in Corsica for some 8 years under Claudius. And under Nero, he knows well the cost of voluntary retreat. Retirement from the work of the Commonwealth needs justification, public and private, and not just the sort that makes theoretical research its own kind of public action that serves the common good. Seneca's concern about retreat, voiced in many of his writings, serves as guidance for our own times when public servants choose or are forced to retire because of evil or corrupt political leadership. In On Leisure, Seneca aims to align his views with the orthodox Stoicism of Zeno, whereas the Epicureans say, the wise man will not engage in public affairs except in an emergency. Zeno says, he will engage in public affairs unless something prevents him. The exemption rests on special circumstances, adds Seneca, a state too corrupt to be helped or wholly dominated by evil. Nero is not far from the page here as Seneca eases himself out of public service. Forced suicide, on Nero's orders, will soon follow. Seneca gives us a clear-eyed view of the systemic constraints that surround personal control and endurance. In this same essay he underscores the point, the hindrance is not in the door, but in the things to be done. We live in commonwealths, local and cosmopolitan. We work within the local commonwealths through the externals of power and office, until we can't. Assent to impression itself has limits in giving us freedom. We can push the limits out fairly far, but again, we are constrained by access to input, implicit bias, as well as our own intellectual curiosity and defiance. Mental control can hit barriers, even when we are not suffering dementia or neuropsychological disorders. Still, the Stoics have promising tools for greater empowerment. But that said, we need Stoic exhortation and discipline to push the boundaries outward, whether those boundaries are internal or external. With assent to impressions as a starting point, let's turn to other specific Stoic techniques for self-control and how we can best implement them in our lives. Physical training and mental discipline. Recently, I found myself on a physical therapy table doing exercises for a rotator cuff tear, exacerbated by too much swimming. While doing my boring 30 by 3 shoulder abductions with a dumbbell, my physical therapist, Chris, asked me what I do for a living. I'm a philosopher and I'm writing a book on Stoicism, I said. His face lit up. I now had his full attention. Chris is a well-built, athletic guy who trains hard and treats folks like me, as well as serious athletes. He tells me he's listened to Tim Ferriss's podcasts on Stoicism and has also read a Ryan Holiday book on Stoicism. He tried listening to Marcus Aurelius's meditations on his commute to and from work. But it wasn't exactly a gripping yarn. Too many disconnected snippets. Yup, he replied. It jumped around too much. So he went back to podcasts on Stoicism. The philosophy really appealed to him. When I asked why, It became clear that it had to do with the idea of hard training and discipline. Building strength or regaining it in the face of injury is what he teaches and coaches. Transferring strength and stability exercises to a different arena made perfect sense to him. In my own case, he had told me that the natural wear and tear of a mature body plus repetitive overuse is what did my shoulders in. Psychologically, we face the grind of wear and tear daily. The mind, no less than the body, needs healthy exercises to mitigate the impact of injury and heal trauma when it occurs. Chris and I were on the same page. Epictetus casts physical training as a model for overall mental discipline. Whatever means are applied to the body by those who are exercising it may also be valuable for training, if in some way they aim toward desire or aversion. He then warns that the point of a toned body or psychological toughness is not to build a fan base. If their aim is mere display, these are traits of a person who has turned to externals, and is hunting after something other, and is seeking for spectators to exclaim, "What a great person." Training is for the purpose of discipline, not adulation. It helps build character, and is a sign of the effort and striving of aspiration. Pre-rehearsal of bads. One of the better-known Stoic exercises for finding calm is pre-rehearsing future evils or bads. Anticipate the traps that lay ahead. Don't be caught off guard. The exercise goes back to the early Greeks. Cicero approvingly quotes a fragment from Euripides. "I learned this from a wise man, over time. I pondered in my heart the miseries to come, a death untimely, or the sad escape of exile, or some other weight of ill, rehearsing, so that if by chance some one of them should happen, I'd not be unready, not torn suddenly with pain." Euripides, he says, in turn, takes a lesson from the pre-Socratic Anaxagoras who, legend has it, said when his son died, "I knew my child was mortal." The Stoics turn the teaching into a premeditation exercise, regularly rehearse potential future evils to mitigate the shock of accident and tragedy. I don't think I have ever uttered Anaxagoras's remark in an undergraduate lecture on Stoic ethics without my students being horrified at the message. They roll their eyes in disbelief. "It's cold and callous," they say. They can't believe I'm expecting them to take Stoicism seriously, if that's what it teaches. It's as if I told them then and there that their parents don't love them, or were willing to abandon them at any moment. It takes a lot of backpedaling to make the Stoic message appealing. I typically do. And I begin with the fact that the Stoics, and especially Epictetus, went in for shock and awe. He clearly succeeded. Still, the gist of the message, I suggest, is quite humane. We shouldn't run from the fact of our mortality. But to stop running from that fact takes work. It takes daily pre-rehearsal and a willingness to actually think about potential losses. The Stoics claim that if we do, we can mute some of the freshness of a sudden loss. The Greek term here for fresh is telling. Prosphatos connotes not nearness in time, but rawness, as in freshly slaughtered meat. We need advance exposure if we are to weaken the visceral, raw assault of close-up losses. The technique, presumably, involves more than just an incantation of words. "I always knew my child was mortal." Dwelling in advance may take immersion in imagination, but also some humor and love. When my mother, Beatrice Sherman, was in her mid-90s and in a nursing home, I often thought about how we would talk about death. She was healthy, but I knew the end would soon come, and I knew her well that she wanted to avoid talking about death at all costs. She wasn't a talker at the best of times. When I asked her about a book, she read 3 or 4 novels a week. I was lucky if I got out of her, "It was fine." That was her standard response, "Fine." Life was fine. She wasn't a complainer. But she was into denial of death. And so at some point, I decided we would have to make a joke of it. I would ask every so often as we talked about how much she liked the Hebrew home and her caregivers and friends, "Remind me, Mom, we didn't sign up for the immortality plan, did we? Because if we did, it's going to be really expensive." She would smile gently. She was very beautiful. And she chuckled a bit. Of course, she never said the words, "I always knew I was mortal." But she thought the idea. She couldn't talk about death. It just wasn't her style. But I think our little repeated pre-rehearsal, our joke about the immortality plan, made her last days easier for both of us. We shared our mortality, and we shared not dreading death, together. My mother died just 3 days after we danced together, she in her wheelchair, and I swirling her around with other couples on the dance floor at the nursing home. She had been coughing a lot the week before, and we both knew that the end might be near. The antibiotics weren't working. The nurses were monitoring her closely. We spent the last day together, in her room, facing death together. Our little whimsical joke about the immortality plan was preparation, she for leaving this world and me for saying goodbye, and that it was going to be on my mom's terms, fine. Pre-rehearsal, as I've intimated, is a form of pre-exposure, a desensitization ahead of time. If events don't occur, then we take it as a gain. In the case of death, the question is only when. There are contemporary, clinical parallels to the notion of pre-rehearsal. Some may be more familiar with exposure techniques that work on desensitization after the fact. Clinicians have for some time successfully used evidence-based prolonged exposure, PE, therapy, after the fact, to reduce post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. PE is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, itself with roots in Stoicism, during which patients confront, in vivo or through imagination, situations or events that are reminders of traumatic situations, though now experienced in safe settings. Through repeated approach, rather than avoidance, the fear response is deconditioned rather than reinforced. Take the case of military service members exposed to the constant threat of improvised explosive devices. Survival depends on quickly responding to those threats. But the fear response can become overreactive. Hypervigilance is adaptive in a war zone, but not always after war. At home when thunderclaps are heard as gunfire, fresh bumps on a pavement read as newly planted bomb sites, a black plastic bag on a lawn a hiding place for an explosive. Re-exposure to stressors by talking about them, seeing them in virtual settings, and revisiting and processing memories in a relationship where there is trust and safety become a way of deconditioning both the avoidance response and hyperreaction. The neutral garbage bag on a lawn or new bump on the neighborhood road over time loses its associated negative valence. In more recent studies, researchers have begun to investigate pre-treatment exposure. Attention bias, or to cast the idea in Stoic terms, the patterns in our ascent to impressions, is modulated by balancing focus between threat and neutral stimuli. The idea is to learn to shift attention, so that we develop perceptual and cognitive resources for focusing not just on threat, but on neutral situations. Research suggests that advanced training of this sort in shifting focus between threat and unthreatening stimuli reduces anxious hypervigilance characteristic of PTSD. In a related research experiment, Israeli Defense Force combat soldiers in units likely to face potentially traumatic events were exposed to attention bias modification training sessions. Through computer programs, they were trained to attend to threat in an attempt to enhance cognitive processing of potentially traumatic events. The idea is to make the response to stress cues adaptive and agile, elevate the response in acutely threatening situations in combat, but train it to be transient, so that it recedes in safe circumstances. Again, we can put a Stoic gloss on this. Train in advance to withhold inappropriate assent to impressions of threat by laying down alternative patterns of assent to impressions of calm and safety. Of course, Stoic standards of what is and isn't appropriate won't map onto what most of us commonly hold to be appropriate or adaptive. The devil is in the details of how we interpret the doctrine of indifference and what will count as wise selection. But the general Stoic idea of preventive exposure and training in what we focus on in our environment is prescient. The Stoics go on to suggest that pre-rehearsal may reduce the compounding effects of secondary distress, or as Cicero reports, the distress that we were caught off guard and might have been able to prevent what happened. Of course, hindsight bias can be magical thinking, a tendency, after the fact, to overestimate our ability to predict an outcome. Should-haves and could-haves can be grandiose ways of misattributing responsibility. Sometimes, they are ways of coping with grief or survivor guilt, as I learned in my work with military service members returning from deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. We tend to take moral responsibility in order to make sense of what seems senseless. In the case of service members, many replaced flukish luck with failed moral agency. Moral injury, the extreme moral distress of real or apparent moral transgression, as agent, victim, or bystander, can result. Conscientiousness becomes overwrought and anguished. But moral conscientiousness needn't always be anxious. Many ways of being prepared, and being responsible for being prepared, are far from irrational or overwrought. They are what good people do to take care of themselves and others. This is in sync with Stoic notions of taking preparation seriously at a personal and societal level. Still, Stoic pre-rehearsal, if it focuses on the glass half empty and not half full, can seem a recipe for inducing anxiety. Reducing future distress comes at the cost of increasing present distress. We ruminate about worst possible cases, imagine how we would react to bad news, become preoccupied with adversity and loss. We are in battle mode before there is a war to fight. But again, there are good and bad ways of being future-minded. Strategic thinking, risk analyses, long-term planning, and coordinated and collaborative efforts all are ways to mitigate disaster that help reduce the emotional overlay of individual debilitating fear or depression. They are not necessarily ways of being alarmists, but ways of being realistically prepared. Anticipating a natural or medical disaster is a collective enterprise, managed by institutions. But anticipating profound personal loss is something else. And each of us has different resilience levels, to do with psychological, social, political, and historical factors and more. Epictetus suggests that we can train for personal loss by gradually increasing the stakes. We move incrementally from rehearsing small potential disturbances to great ones. In the case of everything that attracts you or has its uses or that you are fond of, keep in mind to tell yourself what it is like, starting with the most trivial things. He suggests we start with a jug. If you are fond of a jug, say, "I am fond of a jug." Then, if it is broken, you will not be troubled. Again, the advice makes no sense if it's just a verbal incantation, tacit or expressed. Let's try to fill it out. We give ourselves advance warning. I say to my husband, as I recently did, "I really adore this Richard Batterham large fluted Celadon crock. I'm going to be really upset if either one of us breaks it." What's unsaid but both of us are now queued up to think, is, "Let's be careful." And that might lead to a conversation, again, half tacit, half spoken, about whether it's the end of the world if it breaks. It's meant to be used. Storing the bread in it now is a perfect use for it. We'll be really careful. Why have it if we don't use it? And if it breaks, well, it breaks. Maybe something like that is what Epictetus is inviting us to rehearse. It's all too fast in his formulation. But we're not at his lectures in real time, milling around with other followers, analyzing and interpreting. We're doing it now, some 2,000 years later. We're trying to imagine rehearsing loss at the same time as we think about recalibrating our values about what really matters. We're trying to test how stoic we are. Epictetus then widens the sphere of practice. If you go out to bathe, picture what happens at the bathhouse, the people there who splash you or jostle you or talk rudely or steal your things. Remind yourself about what you might expect. The case, again, hits close to home. I often think about going to the Y at the end of the day for an outdoor swim, in winter and summer, and in winter, a post-swim warm-up in the hot tub or sauna. But the locker room is often crowded with screaming teens coming in from swim team practice. Are they going to be there today? Is it a practice day? Did I time my visit just right? If they're there, it's not what I want at the end of a tough day. But now, if I'm listening to Epictetus, he's telling me if at the outset I say to myself, "I want to bathe, but I also want to keep my will in harmony with nature," that is, in sync with how things turn out, then I'm less likely to get angry about what is happening. It makes sense. I will have given myself an advance talking to. I'm armed. If the swim team girls are giggling and gossiping at high volume, then it won't be what I wanted initially, but I may be better poised to adjust expectations. Epictetus then graduates from triflings to what's most pressing in our lives. The now familiar anecdote gets embellished. When you kiss your little child or your wife, say that you are kissing a human being. Then, if one of them dies, you will not be troubled. Wait. This is a steep progression, from a broken jug to the loss of a loved one with an unruly throng at the bathhouse somewhere in between. Pre-rehearsal may give you a perspective on mortality, but to think that it averts grief suggests both the worst parts of Stoicism and psychologically unsound ways of dealing with loss. Is there a way to humanize the view? The following may help, even if it doesn't soften the view. Stoic mental preparation involves working one's way up to tough tests that we might face and know we would if only we had fuller, divine-like knowledge of how things will unfold. Some of those future scenarios and counterfactual reactions to them, if this were to happen, then we might now find outright distasteful. Explains Epictetus, Chrysippus was right to say, as long as the future is uncertain to me, I always hold to those things which are better adapted to obtaining the things in accordance with nature, for God himself has made me disposed to select these. So, if I knew I was destined to be ill, I'd have an impulse to be ill. And 2, if my foot had a mind, it would have an impulse to get muddy. That is, what are now dispreferred indifferents might in another context be preferred and appropriate to select. Seeing that we do not know beforehand what is going to happen, it is appropriate to adhere to what is by nature more suited for selection. Of course, we don't know what it is to adhere to what is by nature in the absence of knowing nature's full secrets and how and when they will be disclosed to us. But what we can do is train to be adaptive and prepare ourselves for the worst, even if we hope for the best. Pandemics are again a salient case. With guidance from expert epidemiological and policy teams, economists and medical researchers, take steps to prepare. Teach the public to imagine what seems unimaginable. And then prepare for the personal and emotional toll. Know the attitudes that travel with disaster, anxiety, dread, massive sorrow and grief, loneliness, dislocation, a sense of an empty future. And know the sources of comfort and support. There is no way we can be immune from psychological distress. Nor would we want to be. Moreover, any armor that claims to fully protect is a scam, a fool's errand. Still, there are Stoic lessons we can learn about possible ways of minimizing and managing distress, both on a personal and institutional level. And the app of pre-rehearsal is at its core. Try to make hardships that are distant and almost unthinkable real and proximate. And then imagine best responses in those hard cases. What is a path forward? That's a way to humanize the account and update it for our times. Are there other Stoic techniques for mitigating emotional distress? Hedges and reservations. In addition to pre-rehearsal, the Stoics teach us to frame our plans and intentions in a way that mentally prepares us for the possibility that things might not work out as we'd like them to. They advise this technique: tag on to your intentions, or as they say, impulses toward preferred indifference, a tacit mental reservation, if nothing happens to prevent it. We can think of the strategy as a way of hedging bets. Things may not work out. Always think of what you want as tentative. Here's Seneca illustrating the mental technique. Say to yourself, I will set sail unless, something interferes. I shall become praetor, a Roman magistrate, unless something thwarts it. My business will be successful unless something interferes. Epictetus invokes a similar idea, reminding his listeners about effective ways to modulate attitudes toward indifference. Given we are not sages, what is up to us which it would be fine to desire, is not now present to you. And use only impulse and aversion, but lightly and with reservation and in a relaxed way. Epictetus's points are compressed and in Stoic idiom. The gist is this: as non-sages, we don't yet have stable access to fine or noble desires directed at the only real good, virtue. Instead, what we have at our disposal are impulses and aversions directed at indifference. In going light on those impulses, we avoid excess and strain, the ache of yearning and the anxiety of panicky avoidance. Mental reservation adds the thought like that of the cautious bather at the public bathhouse: it may be noisy there. Readjust your expectations. What you find may not be what you originally hoped for. A late 1st century BCE Stoic, Arius Didymus, invokes a similar idea from the Old Stoa. They also say nothing contrary to his desire or impulse occurs in the case of the worthwhile man, because he does all such things with reservation and nothing adverse befalls him unforeseen. But what exactly is the advice here? Should we always qualify impulses so they become fail-proof? Impulses, on this reimaging, come with built-in cushions, a bit like car airbags that inflate upon impact in an accident. Formulated in the right way, impulses ensure psychological immunity that protects when you need it most. The idea seems a bit too good to be true, psychologically, if not logically. Maybe a better way of thinking about reservation is on the financial trading model. Most of us are familiar with the tagline that's standard in market prospectuses: Past performance is no guarantee of future results. It's a warning not to assume an investment will do well in the future just because it did well in the past. Market climates change. We have to be adaptive. But equally, what did poorly in the past may just as easily be an opportunity in the future. Either way, we have to be agile, not market timers, but poised to rebalance on a regular basis to meet target asset allocations. This is actually a useful way of thinking about key Stoic texts on mental reservation. No, the Stoics were not financial advisors. If anything, their cynic roots make them suspicious of money. Recall the cynic motto from Diogenes, deface the coinage. The point of the financial analogy is, rather, that information about the world and our best analyses of it are constantly changing. Impulses should change and be responsive to those updated ways of seeing the world. So to return to Seneca's example, I'll go on a boat ride. But I'll change my plans, and motive or impulse to carry it out, if I notice that a storm is setting in. I plan to campaign for election as a Roman magistrate. But I'll change my plans, and impulse to go forward, if my bid for election seems highly unlikely. And so on. In the sage's case, there is quick responsiveness to new information. This is a highly idealized case. The sage's impulses align with the present epistemic landscape. The sage doesn't assent to future, wished-for, contingents. He keeps updating impulses in light of updated beliefs. In short, the sage doesn't get stuck on what's wished for or what was. Motive always tracks cognitive changes. And cognitive agility guarantees keeping up. Seneca unpacks the idea behind mental reservation in this way. It captures the preceding idealized line of reasoning, but with a few critical additions. This is why we say that nothing happens to a wise man contrary to his expectations. We release him not from the accidents but from the blunders of humankind. We ought also to make ourselves adaptable, lest we become too fond of the plans we have formed. He accents the last point. Both the inability to change and the inability to endure are foes to tranquility. The first point to note is that the sage is protected not from accidents or misfortune, but from human error. And this is because a sage's knowledge keeps up with the facts in the sense of what's objective and outside the knower. It's in this sense that things aren't contrary to his expectations. It's not that the sage cushions all impulses against disappointment or failure. Rather, she changes impulses to keep up with what is now the case. We fallible beings are not so lucky. Our knowledge isn't always one step ahead of accidents. But then Seneca brings the sage down a little to our human level. A sage may suffer by having to abandon plans and desires. So here we learn that the sage makes emotional investments that can actually lead to pain. But the suffering, dolorum, will be much lighter, if success isn't promised, that is, if there is mental reservation, and there is a capacity to be adaptive. That is a tip for all of us, even we who are fallible and who invest with more passion than is often wise. Overall, this is a remarkable set of lessons with implications for our times. If the fundamental point behind mental reservation is cognitive agility, facing facts squarely, trying to keep up with fluid informational landscapes, then the Stoic idea here is less about how to beat frustration than about how to change motivations in ways that align with new and reliably curated information. Beating frustration may be an indirect windfall, but the work in getting there is cognitive. Of course, as we said, the Stoics idealize the model. The sage is an exalted knower, indeed, an infallible one, who doesn't have to worry about assenting to misleading and attractive impressions or clinging too tightly to health or clean feet when the inevitability of disease or muddy feet is how nature is unfolding here and now and guiding what we should assent to. And he doesn't seem to have to worry either about all the unconscious ways we take in impressions without surveillance or will. But even so, the general idea of being responsive to a changing world, aided by exercises in pre-rehearsal, is a cautionary lesson for trying to find calm in unnerving times. Like an archer. Another way the Stoics counsel us to adapt to the uncertainty of outcomes is through an analogy with archery. In shooting an arrow, the objective is to hit the target, but the goal or end is to do all in one's power to shoot straight, to do all one can to accomplish the task. So there are two values, an objective, about preferred outcomes, and an overall end or goal, about striving. In terms of living a good and morally decent life, Missing the mark with respect to specific actions is compatible in the course of a life with achieving the overall end of excellence or virtue. Put otherwise, virtue is in the striving, in doing everything we can to live a good life. The accidents of bad luck may frustrate our objectives and preferred outcomes, but not the overall end of virtue or goodness. The two values, indifference or preferences and virtue or goodness, are distinct. Many would say, again, this is the harsh side of Stoicism. Shouldn't we be distressed by accidents and bad luck that frustrate the objectives of our good actions, to save lives as a healthcare worker, to keep innocents out of the crosshairs of fire, to save a toddler in a playground accident? Even if tragic outcomes don't impugn our best judgment and fine efforts, don't they typically stress us and, if severe enough, shake our confidence that we did everything we could? And isn't that distress a good thing, a sign that we care and are invested in the world around us? Consider the following case to test Stoic intuitions. In the fall of 2019, I gave a keynote speech on moral injury at the Psychotrauma Center in Amsterdam to a group of clinicians, senior first responders in fire, police, and the military, as well as humanitarian aid workers, among others. Firefighter Art van Oosten told us of a harrowing choice he had to make one Christmas Eve. He was having a holiday meal with his family when he received a call to lead a rescue operation in the close-knit, small Dutch town of Arnhem-Uiden. The apartment above a Chinese restaurant was ablaze and 4 children of the restaurant owners were trapped inside. The parents stood outside the building in shock as they watched the flames balloon out the upper-story windows. 3 firefighters already on the scene had tried to rescue the children, but the flames had overwhelmed their efforts. Conditions had only worsened. As Art surveyed the scene, the question was no longer how to rescue the children but if they should be rescued. And his judgment, with 30 years of experience behind him, was that the mission was futile. The children couldn't be saved and the firefighters wouldn't survive the rescue attempt. With a heavy heart, he went to break the news to his colleagues and to a police officer who was with the parents. When Art arrived home that evening, his wife already knew of the aborted mission from having followed a news broadcast. She worried about his safety but also his career. They had lived through a previous incident of a lethal fire where the media had severely criticized the fire department for not being able to save lives. He assured her and his children that the causes of the deaths of the children were not his or anyone's fault. The firefighters could not have done more that evening. The next couple of days were marked by psychological trauma aftercare for himself and his crew. He made sure that recovery of the bodies was carried out by the police who were doing the investigation and not by the firefighters who had been at the rescue scene. Several days later, the police released a post-incident report determining that the children had succumbed to the flames before the firefighters arrived. That brought some solace. Still, the fire stays with Art, because, as he explains, he made a conscious and deliberate choice to stop saving. Despite his years on the force, it was the first time that he had experienced an emergency of this magnitude. When he speaks to first responders, as he did to our group, he tells them that it is almost impossible to fully mentally prepare for this sort of emergency. Everyone experiences a fire like this differently. And there should be no shame or stigma in seeking psychological help. I wept as I listened to Art take us back to that night. I was spellbound by this fireman, admiring of his moral and professional leadership, his ability to make calm and circumspect judgments in an acute emergency, his psychological acumen, his protection of his people and concern for the family of the 4 children, his protection of his own family, and his clear-eyed sense of how a small town might judge him, and yet his ability to separate accident, fortune, and reputation from doing his work well. That is one Stoic lesson to reap from this case. Art is a highly skilled, exemplary professional firefighter. And he leads his team with insight and professional intelligence. Not all actions and omissions in firefighting will yield the desired outcomes. It is a high-risk activity, and selecting wisely in this business means facing lethal fire and its consequences. Preparation trains, but it doesn't fully inure against disaster. That's a modified Stoic lesson. Art's judgment to call off the rescue operation was validated by the after-incident report. And that gives some solace. But the harder Stoic tonic to swallow is that even if the children had perished after the firefighters arrived, the wise selection in the circumstances, protecting the firefighters from a mission that would have cost them their lives, as well as the lives of the children, should also bring peace of mind. For the Stoics are committed to the view that virtue is a skill like being a good doctor. Good doctoring isn't a guarantor that interventions will work. Will and intelligence, the best medical expertise and equipment, can only control so much. Medical workers live with the solace of doing their best. Good firefighters do as well. So, too, argue the Stoics, do good persons. Good professionals aren't always good persons. But many are. And aspiring to achieve the finest is common ground. Healthcare workers on the front lines know this implicitly, as does Daniela Lamas, a critical care doctor in Boston's Brigham and Women's Hospital. She is on the phone with the husband of a patient. It is the end of March 2020. COVID-19 is raging. I was not sure what to say. We were midway through one of the family update phone calls that have become our new reality in the visitor-free intensive care unit when he paused. He had a question. His wife had been on the ventilator a few days now and he understood that these machines might be in short supply. He just wanted to make sure, were we planning to take her ventilator away? You don't know her, he went on. Yes, her cancer is advanced. But before this pneumonia she was taking conference calls from her hospital room. She's smart as a whip. Funny too. We have plans together, he told me. Places we want to see. It was then that I realized what my patient's husband was doing. He was trying to prove to me that his person was worth saving. I hang up the phone and return to the buzz of the unit to check on my patient. Sepsis from her pneumonia, coupled with the immune compromise of chemotherapy, threatens to overwhelm her. Though the ventilator is helping to buy her time, she still might not make it. But I know if she dies, I will be able to tell her husband that we did everything we could. I will be able to tell myself that too. This is sage counsel for a modern Stoic. Goodness, and the peace of mind that can come with it, is in doing our best, operating at the highest levels of excellence with those similarly committed. Excellence doesn't bring immunity from failure or suffering. It doesn't bring immunity from moral distress. But it is a source of psychological sustenance of a profound sort. Dr. Anthony Fauci, age 79 at the time of an interview, is asked how he would like to be remembered after the coronavirus pandemic is over. You know, I just would hope that I'm remembered for what I think I'm doing, is that I'm doing the very best that I possibly can. Good doctoring is the model for what the Stoics call the art of living. And it is what most of us who live honorably try to do, live well by doing the very best that we possibly can. Lesson 4. Managing your emotions. Screams and claps and hell yes says. Sometimes they cry. Publisher Andy Ward at Random House describes the emotional reactions in his office every Wednesday afternoon when the New York Times bestseller list shows up in inboxes. It's tense. There's this moment of quiet as the attachment opens, and then you hear screams and claps and hell yes says echoing over the floor. It's a beautiful thing, he says, but not as beautiful as making that call to an author who has worked so hard to make her book a reality and telling her that she is an official NYT bestseller. That moment never gets old. It's impossible to be jaded about it. Sometimes they get quiet, sometimes they cry, sometimes they yell "Oh my God." All of the above are appropriate. But are they appropriate for a Stoic? Ward's thrill, and that of his authors, hangs on success, external recognition, striving that paid off with tangible positive results. But is that delight, so tethered to externals, a permissible kind of Stoic joy? Conversely, what if an author were depressed that the book, to which she devoted so many years of hard work, was a flop, misunderstood, and poorly promoted by the publisher? Is being peeved, saddened, or angry appropriate for a Stoic? Or should a Stoic just take it all in stride, be calm, and carry on? And what of grief at loss of life or livelihood? What about frontline hospital workers who feel the full emotional weight of work during a pandemic? They carry the grief of witnessing massive loss of life and the fear of infecting their families once their shift ends and they open the door at home. Many fear the loss of a paycheck should they themselves fall ill. Are these appropriate emotions for a Stoic? If the Stoics forbid basic emotions such as desire, fear, pleasure, and distress, and all the many shades of emotions that fall under them, then what's left of the human face of emotional response? That's a way to begin to ask, do the Stoics have emotional skin in the game? I answer that they do. But we need some background to make sense of their answer. Layers of emotion. The Stoics hold that there are three distinct layers of emotional experience. At the center are basic or ordinary emotions, desire and fear directed at goods and bads in the future, pleasure and distress directed at goods and bads in the past or present. These emotions and their subtypes make up the vast swath of emotional experience in our lives. Following Aristotle, the Stoics hold in an even more robust way that primary emotions are cognitive. They are beliefs or thoughts that are motivational. In the case of desire, that successful reception of my book is a good to be sought. In the case of fear, that the grizzly bear is dangerous and to be avoided. In the case of pleasure, that this wine has a lovely nose and is worth savoring. In the case of distress, that the death of my mother is a serious loss that brings pain. At a more granular level, beliefs are impressions that you assent to, ways of accepting how things seem. Assent is implicitly voluntary, and so, the Stoics hold, emotions are voluntary mental actions. They are up to us. Again, Seneca outlines the view in the case of anger. This key text makes explicit that emotions are things we do, not things we passively suffer. Anger is set in motion by an impression received of a wrong. But does it follow on the impression itself and break out without any involvement of the mind? Or is some assent by the mind required for it to be set in motion? Our view is that it undertakes nothing on its own, but only with the mind's approval. To receive an impression of wrong done to one, to lust for retribution, to put together two propositions that the damage ought not to have been done and that punishment ought to be inflicted, is not the work of a mere involuntary impulse. That would be a simple process. What we have here is a complex with several constituents: realization, indignation, condemnation, retribution. These cannot occur without assent by the mind to whatever has struck it. Anger does not happen to us. We choose it. The complex process mixes distress and desire, pain at being wronged, desire for retribution. Neither distress nor desire is a blind impulse. Both are implicitly chosen motives consisting of two evaluations, of being unfairly wronged, the damage ought not to have been done, and of what would count as an apt reaction, that punishment ought to be inflicted. An emotion is thus, as Cicero had earlier explicated Chrysippus's view of distress, a two-tiered evaluative judgment, that a bad has taken place and that it requires an appropriate or fit behavioral response. This is a description, and an elaborate one. The broader Stoic prescription is simpler. Basic or ordinary emotions, like anger, are fundamentally irrational. They are perverted cognitions, false evaluations about what is really good and bad. Insults and offenses, dangers and threats, love and grief attached to objects that are not genuine goods and bads. They are indifferents, in general, to be preferred or dispreferred, as we for the most part do, and should, by nature. But preference or selection is not the same as emotional investment. It is those sticky, ordinary emotional attitudes of wanting and holding, fearing and grieving, that can lead to perturbation and excess, and can derail control. Chrysippus depicts the excessive impulse by a smart analogy with a runner. Once in stride you can't easily stop. Seneca embellishes the metaphor: being angry is like standing on the edge of a precipice. Once the descent begins, there is no going back. It's like a body in free fall. It keeps going, without heeding reason. Still, there is a way of experiencing emotions without excess or loss of control. This happens when emotions are focused on genuine goods and bads, namely virtue and vice. The wise person, or sage, who is the ideal of Stoic morality, has cultivated those good emotions. This takes us to a second layer of emotional experience. Good emotions are the healthy analogues of ordinary emotions. They are emotions focused on virtue and the avoidance of vice. They evaluate the world correctly, the Stoics teach. They capture what is really good and bad. In this sense, they are moral emotions. Only a sage can perfectly cultivate these emotions. Our job is to aspire. While aspiration can be a setup for striving that can lead to no real progress, the Stoics are committed to the idea that disciplined moral training can lead to psychological transformation. Striving to cultivate good emotions, however imperfectly, is key. The cultivated emotional analogues look like this. In place of clingy desire for external goods, the wise person will experience rational desire aimed at virtue and virtuous deeds. Granted, even a Stoic moral paragon will still prefer health over disease, love over loneliness. But her selections, however much preferred, are wise and prudential based on an appreciation that what's being selected are indifferents. We might not get what we prefer. Similarly, instead of pleasure in external goods, a sage experiences rational joy, or, as Seneca elaborates, exhilaration and uplift of mind in her good character and deeds and those of virtuous friends. So, for example, a sage will experience a thrill in giving or making sacrifices for the sake of what is fine or just. Presumably, too, even a sage will delight in good food and good friends, but in the way a truly good and virtuous person would, without any whiff of intemperance and with a deep sense of generosity free of annoyance or envy. In place of fear of death or loss of friends, a sage will have cultivated rational caution, a kind of wariness of evil and moral compromise. A sage avoids the entanglements that come with people too fixed on ambition, or who put others at risk only for selfish gain. Death and loss of friends is, again, something a sage will disprefer, but without anxious dread or distress. Other sources echo the general view: the wise person is companionable, tactful, encouraging, and in companionship is disposed to seek goodwill and friendship. And they also say that cherishing, welcoming, and being friends belong only to the righteous. In short, these are the attitudes of mutual goodwill that make up the best sorts of friendship and moral and political fellowship. So, despite the popular view of Stoicism as a philosophy that would strip us of most emotions, the ancient Stoics argue that the very best of us show rational exuberance and desire, and a cautious wariness, lest we be too easily led astray or deceived. We cherish friends and nurture warm and welcoming attitudes toward them. This is what it is to be righteous. Put bluntly, even sages have emotional skin in the game. Still, we might wonder why there is no analogue in the set of rational emotions for distress. Why isn't there a good or rational form of annoyance, frustration, shame, grief, pity, or sorrow? The orthodox Stoic answer is that the only thing that would cause genuine emotional disquiet is the evil of your own wrongdoing or that of your close friends. And that's just not a possibility if you and your friends are among the perfectly righteous. But most of us aren't. And even if we were, if good persons can find joy in the virtue of friends of like character, then why shouldn't they be distressed when they lose those friends to death or illness? Or lose their own robust mental or physical capacities? What's the real worth of rational joy if it comes fully risk-free? Moreover, it is one thing to keep calm in unnerving times, it is another to not notice what is unnerving or to discount it as fake. The Stoics have an answer, and it takes us to the final layer of emotional experience, or more accurately, a sub-layer of pre-emotional experience. The Stoics hold that we experience sub-threshold emotional arousals. Some are near autonomic responses, bodily responses to our environment, like shivering when cold water is sprinkled on us, or our hand recoiling at the touch of slimy things, illustrates Seneca. Whereas ordinary emotional experience requires assent to impressions that something seems attractive or not, these pre-emotional responses fall below the threshold of mental assent. We experience starts and startles, shivers and shakes, blushes and sweats, physical affective arousals that bypass volitional control. They happen to us without the mind approving. They come unbidden and depart unbidden. Still, they have the impetus to start us on an emotional journey, and sometimes an emotional roller coaster, if we fail to take control early on. Even the wisest person experiences these preliminary emotions without culpability. In her case, they are fleeting and short-lived. They are the body talking, we might say, not the mind. If anyone thinks that pallor, falling tears, sexual excitement or deep sighing, a sudden glint in the eyes or something similar are indication of an emotion, he is wrong. He fails to see that these are just bodily agitations, says Seneca. They may be involuntary, but necessary for our survival. Thus it is that even the bravest man often turns pale as he puts on his armor, that the knees of even the fiercest soldier tremble a little as the signal is given for battle, that a great general's heart is in his mouth before the lines have charged against one another, that the most eloquent orator goes numb in his fingers as he prepares to speak. They are adaptive, a rapid registering of life and death signals, that the enemy approaches, that it's time to muster all one's strength, that the troops need to move immediately. In other cases, they give a seasoned orator an edge, an adrenaline kick to work at performance pitch even if it comes with stage fright. In yet other cases, they betray us, as Philo suggests happened to Sarah when she laughed when told she would give birth as a centenarian. It was a nervous laugh, of sorts, and if sudden and quick, maybe just the emotional residue of a former life that slipped out before she could prepare her mind for a more controlled, serene joy. Still, the nervousness may be an important signal of fear. Could she really give birth in a safe way, even if God was behind it? Seneca's point, and Philo's maybe, is that pre-emotions, and their adaptive or signaling functions, do critical work even in exalted models of bravery and virtue. The wise person conquers all adversity, but still feels them. And that is because that person still needs to track salient information through emotional stimuli, whether of an enemy advance, a miraculous birth, or an impending violent storm that may imperil ship and crew. That a skipper blanches white in a sudden typhoon, one Stoic commentator tells us, needn't impugn his virtue. The hardwired signaling may save the crew. How to regain composure is a next step, if there is to be one. This sketch of the layering of emotional experience, from rapid response bodily arousal to ordinary emotional responses to idealized moral emotions, gives some sense of the Stoic preoccupation with emotions and the sophistication of their response. On many dimensions, they are clairvoyant in their thinking about emotions. Leading neurobiologists distinguish between low-road and high-road neural pathways that process emotional stimuli differently. The leading emotion theory among both philosophers and psychologists is a cognitive theory in which emotions are evaluative beliefs, or appraisals. We may not yet rush to embrace Stoic prescriptions for treating emotions, but their descriptions about how emotions work are insightful and highly sophisticated. Anger. My father had a temper. Sometimes it would erupt from nowhere and be slow to abate. On one occasion, when I was about 10 or so, I remember him getting into some row with my mother, the contents about which I have absolutely no recollection. But what is imprinted, as if it were yesterday, was the rage with which he pulled the handset off the kitchen wall phone and flung the receiver. His snatch was so forceful that he detached the cord from the base. There were no cordless phones then. No one was hurt, but his next move was to grab his jacket, storm out the door, and slam it so we, and the whole neighborhood, it seemed, knew he was gone. We didn't see him for many hours. When he returned, I stayed up late that night waiting for him. He had calmed down. But we all walked on eggshells the next week and watched carefully for any signs of a flare-up. Anger is ugly. Seneca opens on anger withholding none of his rhetorical skill. Eyes ablaze and glittering, a deep flush over all the face as blood boils up from the vitals, quivering lips, teeth pressed together, bristling hair standing on end, breath drawn in and hissing, the crackle of writhing limbs, groans and bellowing, speech broken off with the words barely uttered, hands struck together too often, feet stamping on the ground, the whole body in violent motion, the hideous horrifying face of swollen degradation you would hardly know whether to call the vice hateful or ugly. Seneca is feeding a Roman audience bent on violence. There's voyeurism here. But his also warning about the excess and intensity of an emotion like anger. How it grabs hold and won't let go. And then ravages body and soul. Surely anyone would wish to be restored to calm, once he realizes that anger begins with harm to himself, first of all. The anger he describes is retributivist. Payback anger is written into the Greco-Roman psyche. It's the stuff of Homer, on display in the rage of a warrior. But even archaic warrior rage can go too far. When Achilles punishes a dead Hector for the death of his beloved Patroclus by dragging Hector's corpse face down around Patroclus's tomb, the poet is no longer just describing anger. He's taking a clear moral stance. That man without a shred of decency in his heart outrages even the senseless clay in all his fury. Seneca argues that anger of this sort is a primitive defense, a bite-back mechanism that we should conquer. That is how an animal, struggling against the noose, tightens it. To bite back is the mark of a wretched little man. Mice and ants, if you put your hand near them, they turn their jaws towards you. Anything weak thinks itself hurt, if touched. There are infantile roots to this aggression, child psychoanalysts teach, as in Melanie Klein's vivid description of the fanticid attacks of devouring and scooping out the bad breast that withholds milk as a way of punishing the persecutor. Seneca's cautionary lesson is that the psychologically and morally weak bite back at the slightest provocation. Narcissistic injuries, status damages, a sense of being downranked or bested in competition all fuel the payback. The point resonates in the current political moment. Over and over again, we have seen President Donald Trump's vindictive payback in response to narcissistic injuries. The Stoic moral teaching is that the injuries are attached to diseased values. They are injuries we ought not to be suffering if we were valuing the right goods. They are morally flawed responses, in Trump's case, profoundly dangerous, flawed responses that imperil a democracy. Still, if Seneca's lesson is a categorical outlawing of all anger, then he seems to be treading on thin ground. Most of us see important value in feeling and expressing moral indignation, resentment, and moral outcry, and we distinguish those feelings and responses from vengeance or payback. They are part of what motivates a fight for human dignity and rights. They are the passion that generates interest, commitment, perseverance, and adherence to a cause. And they are critical for signaling our commitment and for securing uptake by others as we solicit support and elicit responses. Most of us would argue that it is hard to imagine a sense of justice or goodwill fully stripped of these reactive attitudes and their emotional bite. Imagine a #Me Too movement and its positive work on behalf of women and men without some moral anger propelling it. Or imagine the Black Lives Matter protests in this country in 2020 without public moral outcry at the brutal killing of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis, or of Breonna Taylor by police in Louisville. Or, in a tragically parallel moment more than a half-century earlier, in 1955, John Lewis, then 15, witnessing the lynching of Emmett Till, just 1 year younger, by 2 white thugs and being motivated by that lynching to do what Lewis went on to call good trouble. Could he have become the civil rights leader he soon would rise to become without feeling any animus that day or fear of the brutality of oppression? The overarching question about the place of anger in political justice has been taken up masterfully by philosopher Martha Nussbaum recently. One key point is critical for understanding a plausible Stoicism. As moderns, we need to distinguish relative status, honor, and reputation from the intrinsic attributes at the core of human dignity that may be jeopardized by wrongful acts. The Stoic focus is on honor, rank, and reputation, goods that are ultimately externally dependent. Retaliatory strikes to disses to one's reputation or honor may downgrade a critic's relative standing, and so affect a reversal of status, but the rebalance is itself external. Injuring someone else's reputation relative to one's own doesn't itself improve the intrinsic quality of what one's own reputation may be built on, say, one's work or character or integrity. Nussbaum gives the following case. People in academic life who love to diss scholars who have criticized them and who believe that this does them some good, have to be focusing only on reputation and status, since it's obvious that injuring someone else's reputation does not make one's own work better than it was before, or correct whatever flaws the other person has found in it. The retaliation doesn't itself improve or restore the goodness of one's own work. It's magical thinking, a fantasy of restoration, she argues, to think it would. All the same, it's easy to think that flourishing or eudaimonia will hang on that kind of retaliatory rebalance if status-focused concern, this is all about me and about my pride or rank, is how one fills out what's of ultimate concern in flourishing. But note, this is precisely the force of the Stoic intervention. We misorder our values if we peg them on what's outside our own doing, including external rankings. Yet what about the intrinsic goods that from a modern perspective are the basis of a life worthy of human dignity, health and food security, economic security, bodily integrity, safety against violence, friendship, and the like? If the absence of these goods through individual or systemic injustices threatens dignity, then isn't that a legitimate cause for anger directed at the wrongdoers, especially if it is anger bent on correcting the injustice? Again, in looking for illumination from the past, we have to be wary of not taking off our own glasses. The Stoics value these goods bound up with human dignity, but not in the way that modern social and political thinkers do. On the Stoic view, they are still preferred indifference to be overall promoted in a good, flourishing life, but not themselves unconditionally good constituents of that life. They are the material out of which a good life is built, with wisdom governing the selections. Selection, as we have said before, is not a typical emotional attitude, but a preference behavior meant to free us from the grip of emotional responses that can be sticky, futile, or impetuous. In the case of responding to injustice, a Stoic gloss on that preference behavior is that we ought to strive to make selections that aim at promoting dignity rationally and constructively. Specifically, our behavior ought to resist the fantasy of repairing a wounded ego by wounding someone else's. That kind of rebalancing act is irrational, though it doesn't seem irrational at all to say that sometimes rebalancing is required precisely because goods and positions are limited or are built on unjust structures that need to be redesigned more fairly. In such cases, anger might be an impetus for the restoration of justice, but still, not one pegged to a false narrative about how and why anger works. Take the removal in April 2020 of Navy Captain Brett Crozier from command of the coronavirus-stricken aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt after the leak of an unclassified letter he emailed that detailed failures of senior leadership for help in moving his 6 sailors, among a crew of nearly 5,000, off the infected ship. The letter was a last resource plea. The spread of the disease is ongoing and accelerating. A carrier is a small city. I know from my own experience, having spent a few days on the USS Eisenhower in the mid-1990s. There is no room for social distancing or safe quarantine. Sailors sleep in tight berths stacked 3 high, eat elbow to elbow, clamber up and down ladders all day, use heads with little space for privacy. Once Crozier was removed, what followed was a remarkable show of payback against a crew that had cheered and saluted their skipper in solidarity as he walked down the gangplank and left his command. Then Acting Secretary of the Navy Thomas Modly flew 8,000 miles to blast the sailors for their show of support and to condemn the character of the commander that sacrificed his career to protect them. In a profanity-laced speech delivered over the ship's PA system, Modly said Crozier was either too naive or too stupid to be a commander of a ship like this. The rationale for the message was that Crozier's public image needed to be downgraded in order to raise that of Modly and the Trump administration. The speech failed dismally. Modly soon resigned. Status had little to do with the real reason for the crew's support of the commander, that he showed good judgment and selflessness in an emergency at sea, even if he sidestepped the chain of command. They were saluting not his rank, but his character. Modly's payback couldn't touch that. Modly's anger is exactly the kind of which the Stoics disapprove. Still, the question remains as to whether Seneca leaves room for anger that can be harnessed for good without either ravaging its possessor or fixing on futile fantasies of restitution that downgrade a victim. Seneca casts himself in dialogue with Aristotle, whom he rightly says stands up for anger as the spur to virtue. Its removal would leave the mind unarmed, sluggish, and useless for any serious endeavor. Aristotle, he says, gives it a function, summons it as though it had uses and supplied us with enthusiasm, to battle, to public action, to anything that needs doing with a certain fervor. Aristotle's real position is that we can cultivate smart anger so that it is directed at the right objects at the right time in the right way. This is what it is to hit the mean. But on Seneca's view, smart anger is illusory. There is an inevitable slippery slope. A spur becomes fervor, and fervor becomes rage. Full abstention, on the model of sobriety, sober and wineless days, is the only way to contain the disease. Despite Seneca's insistence that all anger is dangerous pathology, is there room within the Stoic taxonomy for anger that isn't a pathogen? Pre-emotions may give us the space. Anger in its early, sub-threshold moments might be the fuel for more developed constructive protest and reparation. The idea would be something like this. Take the case of systemic sexism. A woman, Betty, repeatedly experiences catcalls on the street, sexual innuendos in professional meetings, professors attributing her remarks to a fellow male student and then endorsing and repeating them as his. In a new job, where she is the only woman in her academic department, old boy sexual jokes are part of the routine banter. Betty's experiences are varied, but what she endures is deeply ingrained misogyny. On various occasions, she experiences some distress, a bodily and mental twitch, call it proto-worry, annoyance, mental pain, vexation. She may let it slide, and things may improve in the department culture without her direct intervention. The #MeToo movement educates. What if the experiences or memories persist, and are more severe and disabling? And the time is right to acknowledge, to assent to the impressions, as the Stoics might put it, that these are deep wrongs endured. The acknowledgement may, at some point, even have to be public, very public. This is the case of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. She felt a civic duty to disclose what Brett Kavanaugh, the then Supreme Court nominee, had done to her as a 15-year-old girl while he was very inebriated at a high school party. At the time of the sexual assault, she feared he was going to inadvertently kill her by suffocating her as he was pinning her down. What she remembers vividly about the assault was his uproarious laughter. She told the Senate how she still hears that sound and responds with traumatic fear. As a psychology researcher, she explained that the threat experienced that day was imprinted in the hippocampus, the brain's rapid fear warning system, like Stoic pre-emotions, that helps keep us alive but also primes us for post-traumatic stress. Blasey Ford did not want to testify before the Senate. She did not want to relive the trauma and endure the political whiplash and potential death threats. These are the ills I was trying to avoid. But now I feel my civic responsibility is outweighing my anguish and my terror about retaliation. After the defense circulated the claim that she named the wrong man in the sexual assault, she was asked directly, "With what degree of certainty do you believe Brett Kavanaugh assaulted you?" She answered, 100%. The hearing has been highly politicized and for some falls on partisan lines. But for many, myself included, her testimony was credible. Her conduct, her composure, her grace and courage under intense questioning, her clear reluctance to have to be there to testify, convinced me that she had not come with a retributive interest in downgrading Kavanaugh or rebalancing status. What motivated her was a moral imperative, a civic duty to share her story about the character of a man nominated to the highest court. Brett Kavanaugh's testimony gave a glimpse of a contrast case, belligerent and aggressive, his voice loud, his face contorting at times, defensive bitebacks at various moments, the sort of depiction that brings to mind Seneca's warnings about anger's ugliness. In Blasey Ford's case, we can imagine early and residual feelings of fear and anger that at some point, privately, and then very publicly, animate duty and a public cause. In speaking up, she also educated a public while empowering other women to break the silence, all at great personal cost. On a generous reading of Stoicism, anger itself, and not just pre-anger, might be the impetus for principled and constructive action. For recall, ordinary emotions, such as anger, are two-tiered. There is the evaluative judgment of being unfairly wronged and the evaluative judgment of what would count as a fit response. Seneca holds, as many ancients do, that the conventional norm is to respond with retribution. But how we act is based on a voluntary evaluative judgment. Culture and history have heavy hands. But the Stoic claim is that emotion is a choice, as is, especially so, how we behave. The point here is that the Stoics give us transitional space for harnessing the impulse of pre-anger and anger in non-retributivist ways. One last illustration makes this vivid. Consider the Netflix 4-part miniseries Unorthodox about a young Jewish woman, Isti, fleeing her husband and Hasidic Satmar roots in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, to start a new life in Berlin. The series is an adaptation of a memoir by Deborah Feldman, who herself was raised in the Satmar community. What one sees in the early episodes is suppressed anger, frustration, a confused sense of not fitting into the world of arranged marriages and baby-making, yet not knowing any other world. The distress is cognitively hazy because horizons are so limited and subordination ubiquitous. Anger is a simmering, steady agitation, expressed in a tight face, a pursed lip, a blank stare, that doesn't have easy words or concepts. What we see and read is perturbance in the body. But then there is flight. Literally. An airline ticket that takes Isti from JFK Airport to Berlin's Tegel Airport. Generalized anger at not fitting in is impetus for flight. And impetus to seek something else. A chance Americano coffee leads to an open conservatory door and a world of music close to her in her Hasidic community. There, women are forbidden to play an instrument or sing. It is a violation of modesty. It shames a husband. Every step of Isti's new life is an exploratory moment in how to navigate an uncharted world. But something fuels it. And it is the constriction, the hollowed-out, contracted feeling that the old world has robbed her of her autonomy. She never gives the words injustice, wronging, or persecution to what she has suffered. She says she hasn't lived up to what God has asked of her. But it is the anger of failure and at falling short of standards that are to her oppressive that propels her to explore a new life of dignity. Consciously or unconsciously, she is making decisions about how to respond to anger appropriately. And that response is nothing short of choosing how to live a good life. Grief. Grief, according to the Stoics, is another form of distress. Since it focuses on losses largely outside our full control, it is an emotion that needs to be managed. It signals that we are hostage to fortune. Loved persons and things, homes and homelands, cultural heritage and religious sites, all are indifferents to be preferred and wisely selected. But their loss ought not totally destroy us. The notion of managing grief in a way that might silence it strikes us as preposterous, especially in the wake of a raging pandemic that has blanketed us in massive and unfathomable loss. We don't choose to say goodbye to loved ones without being able to hold a hand or kiss a brow or sit in a hospital room together to chant a final prayer or lullaby. We have been forced to as a medical necessity. The need to grieve, in ways we think proper, is profound. But just how radical are Stoic consolations on loss? If grief is to be outlawed, then indifference do seem, after all, really matters of indifference. Preference is denuded of positive feeling, whether love of your family or joy and pride in your work. Conversely, dispreference is robbed of the pain that comes with loss. We go toward or avoid with detached selections. We select wisely, but at the cost of our humanity. Cicero and Seneca challenge the orthodox picture. Cicero's challenge is profoundly personal. Having lost his daughter Tullia in childbirth in the late winter of 45 BCE, he retreats to his country estate in the Tusculan hills outside Rome and immerses himself in consolation literature and writes his own consolations as self-help, for my mind was swollen, and I was trying out every remedy I could. Between mid-July and mid-August, he has penned most of the Tusculan Disputations, which includes an analysis of Stoic views of grief and an endorsement of a mild form of Stoic therapy. It is important to remember that Cicero is not himself a Stoic. He self-identifies as a skeptic. Still, he is a careful Hellenistic reader and transmitter of texts, attracted to some Stoic ideas and critical of others. He is eclectic in his philosophy and in his therapeutic method. Some hold that the comforter has one responsibility: to teach the sufferer that what happened is not an evil at all. This is the view of Cleanthes. Chrysippus, for his part, holds that the key to consolation is to get rid of the person's belief that mourning is something he ought to do, something just and appropriate. Different methods work for different individuals, Cicero adds, and the timing of the intervention is as important as the method of intervention. Still, he has little good to say for the method of Cleanthes, the second head of the Stoa. Orthodox Stoicism undermines the very point of consolation. I pass over the method of Cleanthes, since that is directed at the wise person, who does not need consoling. For if you manage to persuade the bereaved person that nothing is bad but shameful conduct, then you have taken away not his grief, but his unwisdom. And this is not the right moment for such a lesson. In short, the sage has lost his ignorance and, with it, the attachment that breeds grief. But for us mortals, like Cicero, offering a sage's lesson at the moment of bereavement is, at the very least, bad timing. Is there a Stoic intervention that has more promise? Cicero contends, the most dependable method as regards the validity of its reason is that of Chrysippus, the third head of the school. It's a method that doesn't deny profound loss, but works rather on changing how we respond to it. That is, it's focused on the second evaluative judgment, what one takes to be apt behavior. But even this is a hard sell for someone, like Cicero, in the throes of loss. It's a big task to persuade a person that he is grieving by his own judgment and because he thinks he ought to do so. Seneca takes on just this task. His consolations, in keeping with the Roman literary art form, begin by acknowledging the loss and anguish. They then move on to explore ways to restore calm and decorum. I am sorry your friend Flaccus has passed away, but I want you not to grieve excessively. He makes clear what he means, not grieve at all. That I will not venture to ask of you. Such firmness of mind belongs only to the person who has risen high above misfortune. Perhaps that's a sage. But even a sage will feel some distress, and even he will feel a twinge at something like this, but only a twinge. As for us, we may be forgiven our tears, if there are not too many, and if we do regain control. The twinge is again a pre-emotion, an emotional scar from the past that the sage can feel without culpability. In another letter, we are told that the wise person's tears flow more generously, they well up of their own accord at the news of an untimely death, or when we are holding the body that is soon to pass directly from our embrace into the flames. The tears are squeezed out of us by a necessity of nature. There's no assent here. It's the body's natural response when struck by grief's blow. Tears, tremors, breath seizing up are all involuntary responses to the shock of loss, whether we are moral exemplars or not. Emotional calm comes later. And even then, calm leaves room for tears. These, preliminary, tears are shed involuntarily. There are others, though, to which we give egress when we revisit the memory of those we have lost and find an element of sweetness in our sorrow when we think of their pleasant conversation, their cheerful company, their devoted service. At that time, the eyes release their tears, just as in joy. These we indulge, the others conquer us. So you need not hold back your tears because another person is standing near, or sitting at your side, nor should you make yourself cry because of them. Neither tears nor the lack of tears is ever as shameful as when tears are feigned. Let them come of their own accord. So, the foe is forced tears, not public tears, as we might have thought, or tears brought on by memory or reflection. What's objectionable is nursing the tears, encouraging them to flow beyond what's in accord with norms of nature or decorum. The problem is excess and theatrics. Some of this sounds reasonable, and gentler counsel than we typically think of as coming from a Stoic. Seneca is a complex figure, some would say hypocritical, and to be sure, inconsistent at the best of times. There is no shortage of tough love in his consolations. The one you loved passed away, find someone to love. Replacing the friend is better than crying. Friends are fungible. People and not just income are disposable. That's hardly a stoicism we want to embrace. But Seneca is never one to hide his own vulnerability. I am writing these things to you, I, who wept for my beloved Aeneas Serenus so unrestrainedly. I understand, now, that the main reason I felt such grief was that I had never thought it possible that his death should precede my own. I kept in mind only that he was younger than I, much younger. As if birth order determined our fate. The repetitive thought, but he was so much younger, keeps the grief alive. Processing this loss, that even youth was not armor enough, offers some calm. He desperately wants calm, as we all do, but also the friendships, like that with Serenus, that sustain us. And so he is a Stoic in the game with us. He is a psychotherapist who treats patients but also treats himself. His times are calamitous, exiles, forced suicides, Rome burning while Nero fiddles, or, at least, performs on his lyre, Leon burning, endless wars, political upheaval, unchecked disease. What his friends are going through, he's going through. The angst is everywhere. It is easy to hear him talking to us. It was that kind of glory he thought was worthy that his letters live on. At the moment, letters from a therapist living in anxious times, with consolations for calm, are all too relevant. A modern therapist's creed is not to share your own grief or neuroses with your patients. You absorb theirs, and if you are a psychoanalyst, make interpretations, without burdening the patient with your own treatment or personal history. But if you are living in a pandemic with deaths mounting every day, what patients are feeling is just what you are feeling: grief, fear of an unknown future, isolation and forced retreat from a face-to-face social world. Freud recommended abstinence, the therapist's blank screen, so that the patient could see her own conflicts and emotions in the transference, and not the therapist's. But when everyone is suffering together, it's harder for the boundaries not to slip. Seneca is a moral counselor. He is not just a listener, but a talker. He admits, he is often talking to himself in his letters. I am sick myself. The man who lives here is not a doctor but a patient. The doctor, too, needs healing. The preferred treatment is philosophical about the nature of loss and how one responds to it. But the core point is that his consolations are never blanket banishments of grief. They are about coping with grief, not about eliminating it. Grief that honors loss is only possible with attachment. Yet attachment to persons is perhaps the surest mark of our vulnerability. It is also key to our resilience. If Stoic resilience is rooted in hard endurance and grit, then what are the social bonds that glue that grit? That is the topic of the next lesson. Lesson 5. Stoic Grit and Resilience. Dancing, a single flock. She lived with a dad who preached the Lord's words. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know how to refuse evil, and choose good. The next morning, the fridge was purged of milk and cheese. Butter was evil. Honey was good. And barrels of it now lined the basement. School was also evil. It carried the taint of government doctrine. Not going to school meant all the girls thought she couldn't read. And they wouldn't talk to her. Her dad was violent. He raged and he punished and he forbade conventional medicine, because it, too, was contaminated with the wrong beliefs. Somehow, she survived it all. She had grit and gumption. And a subversive grandmother, her father's mother, ready to pack her up and take her to a safe place where she could go to school. Won't Dad just make you bring me back? Your dad can't make me do a damned thing. Grandma and she were allies. At times, she and her mom were allies. She took her to dance classes. It was their secret. Dance meant another kind of alliance. An alignment. Bodies talking to each other, mirroring and miming, knowing others because you are doing what they're doing. You connect, become connected. You become a single core, a corps de ballet, even if you have no idea what that means. Learning to dance felt like learning to belong. I could memorize the movements and, in doing so, step into their minds, lunging when they lunged, reaching my arms upwards in time with theirs. Sometimes when I glanced at the mirror and saw the tangle of our twirling forms, I couldn't immediately discern myself in the crowd. We moved together, a single flock. Even if a goose, she was now a swan. The story is Tara Westover's in her piercing memoir, Educated. She gets educated in spite of her father. Whatever resources help build her resilience, and they are many, high on the list, crystallized in dance, is coming to feel connected. This is a key factor in Stoic grit. It's not the one most modern Stoics focus on. Usually, it's tough self-reliance. If you want anything good, get it from yourself, Epictetus says in one of his quotable one-liners. The idea of rugged individualism rooted in Greco-Roman tradition is for many precisely the appeal of Stoicism. Autonomy and independence. Self-discipline. A can-do attitude. But Marcus's imagery, we know, cuts a very different picture. Without each other, we are severed body parts, fragmented and disconnected. We can't function well or at all. The sense of being at home in the world through social connection with others is a deep and pervasive Stoic theme. Stoicism, whether ancient or modern, sees social supports and not just inner strength as critical to how we surmount rather than succumb to adversity. Resilience. Resilience comes from the Latin resilire, to bounce back or rebound. In material science, it is the ability of a substance to absorb energy when it is deformed and then release the energy. When you squeeze a squishy rubber ball, and then let go, it recovers its shape. Resiliency is elasticity. In contemporary psychological writing, resilience has come to mean an ability to cope and find strategies for adapting despite adversity. Resilience is no longer thought of as invulnerability, but rather as adaptability. It involves flexibility and the capacity for growth and recovery in the face of hardship and challenge. Adaptation to adversity is key to Stoicism's strong appeal. As we have seen, some Stoic techniques for meeting the challenge of adversity seem credible, such as focusing on skill and its effective use and not exclusively on outcomes. Similarly, mental reservation, interpreted as a way of adjusting expectations to keep up with shifting information, seems sensible. These techniques, as well as anticipating adverse events so you're not caught totally by surprise, don't offer full immunity. They're protective factors that reduce risk. They don't eliminate it. The overarching Stoic promise is that it is not the stress events, acute or chronic, that build our resilience. It is how we give those events meaning. It is our attitudes and evaluations. Stoic anxiety-reducing methods have at their core the idea that we can learn to shift attention to what we can control. But skill building of this sort is a cooperative endeavor, not a solitary one. The ancient Stoa, after all, is a school for cultivating the resources for personal growth through a teaching relationship and the fellowship of disciples. Ongoing friendships, face-to-face or through letter writing and consolations, are central to the Roman Stoic model of how you model and build strong character. Adaptability, as understood these days, also has a critical social element, such as being open to the support of others and actively reaching out to them through supportive networks. Strong bonds with empathetic caregivers are predictive elements of resilience in children. Across the lifespan, Positive family interactions and thick and strong community bonds are vital resources in fostering the resilience that allows us to face life's challenges. We recreate community in virtual platforms when we can't meet face to face. Hotlines, trauma centers, suicide prevention numbers, substance abuse groups, survivor networks all speak to the need for access to social support. Of course, a willingness to open up to others requires a level of trust in them and the structures of which they are a part. Do they have your interests foremost in mind? Are they fronts for profit? Are they based on sham ideologies? Are providers adequately trained? Are there too many layers of bureaucracy before you can reach help, and so on? Reaching out to others for emotional support requires, in addition, a level of self-trust about what you're feeling and that you have the words or other media to express it. Trust and empathy point inward as well as outward. But the notion of social and empathic support in facing fears and reducing anxiety doesn't sound particularly Stoic. Is it? How social is Stoic resilience? Intertwined. We can begin again with Marcus Aurelius and his battlefield meditations. In Lesson 2 we saw how Marcus paints a vibrant picture of our social interdependence. He builds social support from the ground up. Mind and reason are universally shared. The sharing is concrete. It shows up in coordinated behaviors, synchronies, and alignments, mutual benefactions that are near unconscious and don't beg for notice. A horse runs, a hound tracks, bees make honey, and a man does good, but doesn't know that he has done it and passes on to a second act, like a vine to bear once more its grapes in due season. Goodness begets goodness without grandstanding. We do good deeds as part of what it is to live in a community. Reasonable beings, constituted for one fellowship of cooperation, are in their separate bodies analogous to the several members of the body in individual organisms. The idea in this will come home to you more if you say to yourself, I am a member of the system made of reasonable beings. We are in it together, a unified whole, that survives on cooperative endeavor. Reason, logos, is the cement of the universe on the Stoic view. In some form or other, it is also the stuff of our psyches, including our emotions. To share in reason is to be connected to others through language, argument, emotional expression, and motor resonances, like those felt in battlefield cadres or corps de ballet sharing the dance floor. Marcus regularly invokes this tangible image of reason binding us together in synchronous movement. We are in mutually intertwined movements, working together consciously and unconsciously. Even sleepers, he says, are fellow workers in cooperative enterprise. The idea of mutual endeavor and coordination runs wide and deep. And strength and endurance rely on it. Marcus's remarks are about social connection. But still, they seem to paint a picture of emotionless social distance, with reason doing its connecting and emotions playing little or no role. Reason brings us together, but without much zing or zest. However, in his other reflections, Marcus's attitude is not in the least detached. Thoughts about friends, their deeds and example, inspire joy and are a spur for his own character growth. He prods himself to concretely visualize these exemplars when he needs a morale boost. Whenever you desire to cheer yourself, think upon those who live with you, the energy of one, for instance, the modesty of another, the generosity of a third. For nothing is so cheering as the images of the virtues displayed in the characters of those who live with you, and especially, he adds, when they are brought to mind as a group. So keep them ready to hand. They are part of his personal enchiridion, or handbook. His character sketch of his adoptive father Antonius suggests a relationship he can draw on for investing trust and hope in himself in moments of self-doubt or moral wavering. I should be a disciple of Antonius, his evenness of temper in all situations, his piety, the serenity of his expression, his sweetness, his disdain of glory. These brief portraits are consistent with the famous opening remarks in the Meditations, in which Marcus lists individuals in his life to whom he is indebted for valued character traits. The catalogue is long and the traits concern manners and morals. From my grandfather, a fine character and even temper; from my mother, piety and generosity; from Diognetus, Marcus's painting tutor, avoiding idle sport and impostors; from his mentor Rusticus, to not strut at home in ceremonial garb or waste precious time on superficial thinkers or those who talk around a subject without having any real expertise; from Alexander the grammarian, verbal precision matched with tolerance. For those who fall short, whether because of an occasional howler or too exotic a phrase or harsh expression. He taught that the right reply was not by carping, but by modeling the correct phrase. That's the sort of positive, happy reminder that builds a trust exchange. It's an example of the subtle work of goodwill that goes into building and maintaining strong social bonds. Marcus's catalogue of debts reads a bit like the acknowledgement pages of a book like this one. We recognize those whose contributions have helped shape our intellectual and personal development. But Marcus isn't offering public thanks or acknowledgement. Remember, he's writing to himself, an emperor in the lull of battle, invoking beloved friends and family as supports. The relationships are present, in the tent, so to speak, and formative. Building resilience is an ongoing project, even for an emperor preparing for the next day's battle. The resources reach beyond self. Being at home in the world, connected. Social connection assumes another shape in Stoic thought. And that is through the notion of being at home in the world. The Greek Stoics coin a technical term, oikesis, variously translated as affiliation, familiarization, appropriation, or endearment. Its most general sense is that of belonging, hence, being at home with oneself in the world. In the case of animals, oikesis has to do with self-preservation, being adaptive in one's environment. In the case of humans, the Stoics are keen to tell a developmental story about what is dear to us as naturally good and what is alien to us as naturally bad, that is, the externals or indifference. As physical beings, we aim for self-preservation. As beings with reason, we are committed to its development in a virtuous life regulated by reason. This natural affinity with reason connects us with others. As Marcus fills out the picture, the normative push of nature is for us to live in a commonwealth with fellow rational and reasonable beings. Reason is the common good that binds us and that helps build that social world. The idea that we are social beings by nature has its roots in Aristotle. Aristotle holds that we even owe the existence of our cities not to social contracts, but to the workings of nature and its growth in partnerships from families up to politically organized cities. The Stoics aim to deepen and widen the developmental picture. We begin with a primary impulse for physical survival. As we mature, we come to recognize that our true nature, and sense of self and natural constitution, has to do with our reason and its perfection. Reason draws us to others and grounds cooperative behavior and the duties, or fitting actions, that are due all human beings. The developmental story is complex. But this distills the main themes. What is key here is that even with the shift to reason as the primary focus, it is not my reason, but shared reason. Being at home in the world is sharing in that most fundamental way. We may start with a sense of self as primarily to do with my self-preservation. But over time, the valuations change, including understanding universal reason. It's like making a new good friend, Cicero tells us, through a mutual friend's introduction. One comes to value that person more highly than one does the person who made the introduction. So it is with perfected reason. When we reach the developmental stage of reason coming into its own, we are finally at home in a world. We order values correctly and are sustained by others who share a similar system of values, one also regulated by the norms of reason. Once again, the idea has roots in Aristotle. Aristotle argues that genuine self-love is expressed not in possessing external goods, but in developing the excellence of reason. That doesn't entail, he insists, that self-love is a narcissistic attachment to that reason. When you identify with the authority of reason, you are identifying with how it functions best, in virtuous activity that strains every nerve to do the finest deeds in pursuit of the common good. The Stoics then widen the common good from the polis to the cosmos. The wise person realizes that nothing is more his own than what is allotted not to him alone but to the whole human race. Coming into your own is sharing in humanity. Still, there is an abstractness to this way of being at home in the world. Common pursuit through common reason seems lofty talk, without little insight into the concrete and emotional bonds that connect us to each other. But one way that the Stoics ground reason in the earthly is by making emotions and emotional attachments expressions of reason. More to the point, reason or cognition just is the stuff of emotions. Emotions, as we saw in the previous lesson, are umphy or highly motivational and charged beliefs. Even the cleaned-up good emotions of the sage zig and zag with uplift and sometimes deflation. They are robust, filled with the expansions and contractions, pushes and pulls, highs and lows, characteristic of all emotional experience. Bodily umphs motivate even the wise. The most divine-like mortals scaffold the social structures of resilience and human connection through emotions. For practicing Stoics like Seneca, not yet wise but committed to moral progress, sharing in reason is equally an emotionally laden experience, exemplified in supportive friendships, including epistolary relationships. In the Letters on Ethics, we have a record. We read of Seneca's excitement in sending off a letter and his eagerness in receiving a response, his consolations in grief, his disclosures of his own suffering, his reports of the trivia of the day, and his earnest aspirations to constancy and wisdom. We get a sense of solidarity and empathy meant to sustain each side in hard times. Seneca writes these letters in the last few years of his life, in political retirement, with mortality and the enmity of Nero on his mind. Anxiety and the search for calm swirl on the pages. There is a retreat away from externals to the inner life. But it is done with a friend. When I devote myself to friends, I do not even then withdraw from myself. Paragons from history are part of the support system. We needn't restrict our friends to the living, insists Seneca. Inspiration comes from the giants of the past, Socrates demonstrating his steadfastness to his philosophical principles in his death, Cato's cleaving to the path of virtue in the face of political ambition, Scipio and Cincinnatus in exemplary military leadership. The demigod. Hercules cuts a more complicated figure, as we shall soon see. For although exceptional, his glory-seeking makes for a toxic and unstable mix, however arduous his struggles. Seneca tells us that the sage rises only as often as the phoenix, every 500 years, or so. For critics, a sage so rare is too daunting a model to be emulated. But a sage who shows emotions and who also can be clothed in concrete, historical detail is a way to make what's godly earthly. And that is a part of the Stoic strategy for resilience. We are to visualize exemplary models, including divine ones, who can teach us how to face adversity. This is just what Seneca's contemporary Philo does in his Hellenistic commentary on the Old Testament. Once again, imagine the moment when Sarah nervously laughed to herself in learning that she would give birth to a child. How does surprise, and frankly fear and disbelief, at being able to conceive at such an old age move from trepidation to joy? Sarah, as Stoic matriarch, demonstrates how it's possible to loosen the grip of emotions that make her stagger and shake and come to feel steadier ones that bring inner calm and joy. There are no pointers here about technique. What we get is an example of hope, how anxiety about a most improbable and dangerous birth can gradually shift to trust in a higher authority and equanimity. That is the Stoic Bible lesson. Connections with real or allegorical figures from the past, and friendships in the present, are social elements in building Stoic grit. Seneca's letters are addressed to his younger friend, Gaius Lucilius Junior. The letters are undisguised moral counsel, but they do their work through rapport building. There are no known return letters from Lucilius. This is a literary art form. Still, Lucilius's presence is on the page in questions and answers, news about him from mutual friends, a relationship built through the imagined to and fro of anticipated and received letters. Every time a letter comes, I am with you. Seneca has his eye on posterity here, merited praise that he has been the cause of good of others. If glory lives on through these letters, it's in part in the record of how the Stoics teach through a relationship, and continue to do so. A virtual relationship. I swell, I exult, I shake off my years and feel again the heat of youth. Each time I learn from your letters and from your actions how far you have surpassed even yourself. This is Seneca, the coach, teaching through an idealized virtual relationship. We get joy from those we love even in their absence. We are to imagine a gifted moral tutor focused on the character development of her young students and taking enormous joy in the teaching. Their presence, their conversation has in it a kind of living pleasure. This is especially so when you not only see the one you want, but see that one as you want him to be. All this may seem a bit Pygmalion to us, a moral mentor molding a student as he wishes him to be, with little room for choice or inner freedom on the mentee's part. It sounds Stoic, an imposition from without. To be sure, Goodness is the explicitly taught goal. That's what a Stoic coach wants of his students, and reasonably so. But that obviously leaves a lot of room for how goodness comes to be developed and expressed. The idea is elaborated upon by an earlier Stoic, Pernicius, preserved by Cicero. We have 4 different roles or personae in life. One is our shared rational nature, a persona common to all in virtue of our humanity. A second is our distinctive individual temperaments or constitution. A third is who we are by chance or circumstance. And a fourth, who we are in terms of what we assume for ourselves as we become adults, making choices about who and what we wish to be, and what kind of life we want. The picture is hazy about how we can make meaningful choices about our lives if chance and circumstance radically undercut our freedom. We may not be able to. But when we can, the core idea here is that goodness comes in many flavors. We make choices about what counts as a flourishing life, with our personalities, talents, and natural gifts often guiding those choices. Some of us become by avocation what we are by temperament. Litigators may be litigious, stand-up comics funny, nurses caring, and so on. We have to know our natures in order to choose the right roles in life. We are actors in a play, Epictetus tells us. It's a stock theme in Stoicism. Cicero fleshes out the idea: we make wise dramaturgical choices when we pick the right parts, and here he means career choices most suited to our constitutions and temperaments. You shouldn't feel pressure, he insists, to copy someone else's nature and ignore your own. If we are lucky, we get the right teachers to help guide our choices, especially in late adolescence, when we most need outside counsel. Seneca's accent note often falls on the teacher side of the relationship. Hope in others and aspirations on their behalf begets its own joy. The relationships sustain us as teachers and parents, worthy friends, and partners. In other writings, Seneca details the emotional exchange that makes giving gifts and showing gratitude more than just a thin crust of good manners. In the teaching case, here in the letters, giving is reciprocated in the teacher's own growth and pleasure. Even when we hope in others on credit that they will pull out of a slump or right themselves after consorting with evil, we still are in a certain way educating ourselves. We reinforce the lessons, Seneca writes to his junior, even when death nears, as it now is for Seneca. We model. Good teachers are in the mix with their students. They have been there, or at least can show some empathy for what it must be like. They are still learning and growing. The empathic connection is crucial in effective teaching. Consider a recent political case. In February 2019, Michael Cohen was called before the House of Representatives Oversight and Reform Committee investigating President Donald J. Trump and his inner circle for tax fraud and campaign violations. Cohen was Trump's personal lawyer and fixer for a decade or more. He was brought before Congress to testify, shortly after he had been convicted in federal court on tax fraud and lying charges. The chairman of the House Oversight and Reform Committee at the time was Elijah Cummings, a senior congressman from Baltimore. Cummings is an African American, the son of a sharecropper. He speaks with preacher cadence and passion. In a televised hearing, he is reaching out to Cohen, who famously said he would take a bullet for his boss, but now insists that he is giving truthful testimony. "You made a lot of mistakes, Mr. Cohen, and you have admitted that. And you come saying I have made my mistakes, but now I want to change my life." Cummings draws on his own past career as a lawyer who represented a lot of lawyers, he says, who got into trouble. And you know, if we, as a nation, did not give people an opportunity after they've made mistakes to change their lives, many people would not do very well. So here we have a lesson about the possibility of rehabilitation from a criminal defense lawyer. He has seen how people can go on after a criminal conviction. He's seen people turn around their lives. He's signaling the possibility of post-traumatic growth, even after a transgression of this magnitude. He then acknowledges the seeming unfairness of it all, that Cohen got caught, but others in the Trump administration who may have done equal or worse are going scot-free. See it as an opportunity for growth, he again says, a moment to choose, as Cicero would say, a new path forward. I tell my children when bad things happen, do not ask the question, why did it happen to me? Ask the question, why did it happen for me? He doesn't know why this is Cohen's destiny, but if it is, he says he hopes it may play a role in making him better and making our democracy better. Again, it's a Stoic moment. Life is indifferent, the way we use it is not, says Epictetus. Don't become careless about what falls to you as your lot. Cummings's moral tone here is religious and impersonal. You are the sacrificial offer for others, and though others are, no doubt, as guilty as you are the temple offering. There is something coldly utilitarian here. A person is a fungible placeholder for bringing about the good, even if that individual is culpable and deserving of punishment. Still, in this play, he is the scapegoat for all. But then Cummings' tone switches. The moral point of view becomes deeply personal, an eye-to-eye morality, with a parent talking to another parent. And here is where empathy enters in stunning form. Let me tell you the picture that really pained me. Really pained me. You were leaving the courthouse. And I guess it's your daughter who had braces on. Man, that hurt me. As a father of 2 daughters, it hurt me. And I can imagine how it must feel for you. Cohen, his head hanging low, dark rings under his red eyes, starts to cry. And then Cummings expresses his gratitude, compassionate concern, and aspirational hope. I want to first of all thank you. I know this is hard. I know you face a lot. I know you are worried about your family. He builds another bridge. This time he connects with Cohen and his future in prison. This is a black man teaching a white man about incarceration, and the price of going to the cops and being an informer, in essence, what Cohen did in his trial and now in this hearing. I know it's painful going to prison. I know it's painful being called a rat. Let me explain. I come from Baltimore. I live in the inner city of Baltimore. And when you call somebody a rat, that's one of the worst things you can call them. Because that means when they go to prison, they're a snitch. That's one of the worst things you can call someone. And so, the president called you a rat. We are better than that. We really are. This is a remarkable civic lesson with Stoic teachings about moral progress, choice, and resilience racing through it. What's germane for us now is that empathy is the vehicle of this moral lesson. Cummings is emotionally connecting with this fallen man. I feel your shame, and I understand the remorse you must feel in acknowledging your moral degradation so publicly. I see what it must feel like to bare your soul to your children. I know what it's like to be in prison and be called a rat. But I have hope that you and that we as a nation are capable of investing in worthier ends and of striving toward them. We are better than this, says Cummings in repeated chant. We are in it together, now and for the future. Our children are the messages for a future we will never see. Prophetically, Cummings dies a few months later. But is this a Stoic mode of counsel? Can a Stoic preach moral probity in a way that builds bridges by exposing the teacher's own palpable pain? To be sure, the style and register of an African-American legislator are very far from a Roman orator's, even if the rhetoric of both can take on a sermonizing tone in the public arena. Still, hardship and anguish are the very conditions that create a practical Stoic ethic. Epictetus teaches a new kind of freedom, knowing what political enslavement is. Seneca struggles with abstention with the taste of wine still fresh on his lips. He tries to give up wealth while enjoying palatial opulence. He is the doctor and the patient. Marcus tames his home parade while reveling in the full public splendor of imperial pomp. He minimizes power and glory, but he is, after all, an emperor conquering an empire. Stoicism is born from the wide gap between what we aspire to and where we find ourselves. Few teachers inspire without sharing their own struggles. The Stoics are no different. Stoicism appeals because of the shared need on all sides for calm and composure, humility and ego-taming, even if you are an emperor, or in Seneca's case, a minister in the court of an emperor. Stoic empathy. Empathy is a core element in building the social bonds that undergird resilience. How to build that kind of social capital when individuals and groups are so far-flung becomes a pressing challenge for the Stoics. The lesser-known 2nd-century Roman Stoic philosopher Hierocles takes up the challenge through a metaphor of shrinking the distance between a series of concentric circles. The centermost circle is you, your mind and body, and what's essential for survival. Next is your immediate family, then your extended family, and after that, more distant relatives, followed by neighbors, then tribal connections, on outward to fellow citizens and eventually all of humanity. We connect with the outermost circles by drawing them closer to the center through exercises in imagination and respect, We keep zealously transferring those from the enclosing circles into the enclosed ones. It's incumbent on us to respect people from the third circle as if they were from the second, and so on. It takes zealous exertions to move beyond tribe and recognize others as parts of your community. Hierarchals mimics a contrivance from Plato's Republic to try to contract the distance between the circles. If we call everyone of a certain age group cousins or brothers, uncles and aunts, fathers and mothers, we might simulate closer kinships. Aristotle never thought Plato's ploy would work. Calling all women in a cohort group my mother or all boys in a cohort my son would just make for diluted relationships all around. I had a Taiwanese American student who agreed. After reading this passage from Hierarchals in a seminar, she told the class that when she went to visit Taiwan from her home in the States, her mother insisted that she refer to all her distant relations and friends there as brothers and sisters or aunts and uncles precisely to simulate a sense of a close-knit family. She found it extremely awkward, even when she accepted that she was an outsider to local culture and that cultural differences and distance had made a sense of strong family ties strained. On her view, family building required more than just enforced nomenclature and address. Hierarchals is not trying to create family as much as meet the challenges of a Stoic global community. How do we take on the interests of others we don't live with or know? How do we come to feel like we benefit when they benefit or that our welfare is wider than narrow self-interest? How do we make respect concrete? Hierarchals claims it takes a zealous effort and sustained psychological work to make what's foreign less alien. Later 18th century Enlightenment thinkers sharpen this Stoic idea. Empathy, writes Hume, although he uses the word sympathy for what we today mean by empathy, is a vicarious arousal. It's as if we are attached by a cord. When someone tugs at one end, the other feels the pull. We catch the other's sensation, as if by contagion. We have no extensive concern for society but from sympathy. Hume's contemporary and fellow Scotsman Adam Smith develops a more cognitive view of empathy. We trade places in fancy, imagining what another's life is like. We don't just put ourselves in their shoes, but try to become them in their shoes. The imaginative transport is robust. We beat time with the emotions of others though we have no immediate experience of what other men feel. It is by the imagination only that we can form any conception of what are his sensations. By the imagination we place ourselves in his situation, conceive ourselves enduring all the same torments, we enter as it were into his body, and become in some measure the same person with him. For these thinkers, the challenge for morality is to contract the world without making it a projection of self. To do this, we need empathy and imagination, but also checks on our self-interest and bias. And so, the notion of an impartial judge or observer becomes critical in the Enlightenment construction of a moral perspective. The Stoics haven't arrived at this point yet. Hierarchals pictures bringing distant others into one's orbit. We are at home in the world when we make the world a less foreign place. But sharing a world and its resources requires a home base that's bigger than the self. The American founding fathers, many of whom were readers of the Stoics, shared the Enlightenment concern: how to construct a society that preserves a sense of collective belonging without making membership local and tribal. Hercules and a father's plea for a different kind of strength. We've been sketching Stoic notions of affiliation and empathy key to individual resilience. We are at home in the world when we have a sense of belonging and connection, even to the most distant others. A social self, on the Stoic view, is a global self, however challenging it is to care about, and to be cared for by those outside one's own local circle. Distance and difference are barriers. But so too is the myth of indomitable strength. Stoic resilience can often seem Herculean. The image conjured up is of strength that vanquishes all foes and fears, impossible labors met with mental toughness and physical stamina. Hercules is a hero who risks danger after danger and is still safe. He is invincible. He is a person of action who doesn't admit fear as part of his image. For some, that is a picture of Stoic fortitude. But Hercules is a tragic figure. At least he is in Seneca's play Hercules Rages. Seneca portrays the tragedy as, in large part, to do with Hercules' addiction to superhero action, nursed by a madness sent by Juno. She's jealous of Hercules, the most glorified of Jupiter's illegitimate sons. Having forced 12 labors upon him, she has one final act of wild revenge. This will test Hercules in unparalleled ways. Resilience in this play, Seneca cautions, will come from a source of strength very different from what we associate with Hercules' power. The setting is this: Hercules is poised to come up from the underworld, having finished the last of his 12 labors, the capture of Hades' guard dog Cerberus. He is eager to see his father, Amphitryon, and wife Megara and children, all suffering under the tyrant Lycus who killed Creon, Megara's father, and captured his kingdom during Hercules' absence. Juno rages at the anticipated reunion. Stamp out his great ambition. No more monsters. This time, let him fight himself. Capture Hercules' mind. Pervert his wish, turn his impetuous courage against himself. Hercules then pierces the barrier to this world. He's puffed up with all his works and their glory. If I had wished to rule the underworld, I could have. I scorned death and returned. His hands are now idle and itch for more action. He is drunk on action. More labors for me. Father, wife, I must wait to hold you in my arms. He has Lycus to vanquish and then worship at the altar to re-sanctify the city and its new rule under his reign. The family has to wait. Reconnecting with them through hugs and caresses, visceral contact, is put on hold. He has tasks to finish. His father offers to help with the sanctification. No, I want to do it myself. The plans keep growing. The adrenaline mounts. He has returned, but his family is still waiting for him to come home. And then he's crazed. The self-destruction begins. The family that waited is now his prey. Juno has ensured that Hercules knows no calm. She captured his mind. First, he kills his toddler with Megara watching on. Then he bashes his wife's head. Amphitryon begs to be the next victim so he can't see more. But Hercules has gone numb. Juno is just lifting the curse. He's quieted down now. Hercules sleeps, unaware of the disaster, until he awakens and sees hordes of ghosts. Still, he has no idea that he is the slayer. His father is the bearer of the ghoulish news. He is gentle, soulful, a father who needs to hold his son, touch him and embrace him, at the moment of a tragedy that's near impossible to comprehend. The grief is yours. The guilt your stepmother's. Bad luck is not your fault. Amphitryon enacts the role in this play of the benevolent Stoic therapist. Who has ever called an accident a crime? But if the accidents are bad enough, protests Hercules, they are major crimes. But his father stands stalwart in his benevolence. He won't judge. Bad luck and accident, a vengeful God sending the Furies, is not our doing. Forgive yourself for just this one bad act. Show compassion and empathy toward yourself. I am here for you to mirror mine. When Amphitryon's pleas seem to fall on deaf ears, Hercules' companion and close friend, Theseus, intervenes as empathic peer counselor. His ploy is to make good on Hercules' indomitable pluck. Turn it to the right end. Restrain anger and use your famed courage to fight suicidal rage and the ignominy of being potentially cast as a parricide without the excuse of insanity. Your father's prayers ought to work, but let me also try to move you with my tears. Burst through your troubles, with your usual energy. Use your heroic courage to not stay angry at yourself. Now is the time to muster your spirit to face a different kind of danger, moral and psychic trauma, not just of losing your beloveds, but of unwittingly killing them. This is a remarkable play in which Seneca lays bare the social bonds that must undergird even Herculean courage. Physical strength is insufficient. Self-reliance is inadequate. Hercules' courage has to come from mercy that he can't show himself. Others must model it for him. He must lean on them in order to learn how. And so, Hercules' last labor is the hardest for him, accepting trust and love and reciprocating it. The mutual bond will be his strength. Amphitryon begs him not to take his own life. I beg you, do not leave me lonely in old age. You are the one support of this ruined house, the one light for my pain. Grant me the joy of seeing you and touching you. I beg you. A relationship, father and son, an embrace, touch, the reciprocation of love and care, are foundational for the courage necessary for both of them to go on. It is a courage foreign to Heracles, now and earlier, when he first burst through Hades and saw Megara. And yet there is no other at this point. This is theatre. Seneca is not writing a letter to himself, or picturing a friend receiving it. This is not a consolation on loss. Theatre, performed or not, allows the mythic to become real. And here, what is real are the tragic flaws of an oversized person in the grip of glory who has to face the worst kind of agony, the mental and physical anguish of seeing his family murdered and the conviction that he has committed the crime even while not being culpable. A colleague who is a therapist told me of a case that in an eerie way brought to mind this play or, at least the trauma of an unwitting accident. In this real case, it is an omission that felt as heinous as any criminal commission. She had been treating for some time an emergency responder. He had a complicated psychological history with misfortune and accident riddling his past. But one event racked him. He was called to the scene of a fire as part of a police team. It fell to him to look for 3 children trapped in the burning apartment. He found 2 and rescued them. But he couldn't find the 3rd child. He searched all over her bedroom, and found no sign of her. The room was thick with plumes of black smoke. It was impossible to see. He relied on sound and touch. I felt for her in the bed but did not find her. He later learned that the child who burned to death had crept under the bed. Why did I not feel for her under the bed? I have been trained to think clearly under pressure. How stupid can one be? Did I save her? No. I left her. It doesn't matter if a judge says it wasn't my fault. I failed in matters of life and death. He can't forget. The traumatic memory comes back in flashbacks. He holds himself morally accountable for her death. If treatment is about coming to feel less guilty, about finding some self-mercy, he's sure he's not deserving. It may be correct that I feel so guilty. But guilt threatens to swamp him. Like other first responders, he views himself as part of a tough warrior caste. Showing emotions is weak. It's not what's valued in his work. His work is about action and quick response and not failing. Sifting through the emotional residue of an accident is not part of the job profile. But he can't go on without it. This is a human-sized tragic portrait, yet in the mold of Seneca's Hercules. Heroic labors and rescue deceive us about our strength. None of us is self-sufficient. We need others in good times and bad times. We need others to help us understand our fears and failures. We need others to show us the compassion we can't show ourselves. We need others as we fight fires ripping through homes and ancient redwood forests. We need others to soothe us as houses, and lives, and jobs, and nature are lost. This is a most urgent lesson now. Millions of emergency responders must come to terms with what they could and couldn't do on the front lines, whether in the face of fire or disease. They have lived with torrents of fear and anxiety. They have felt helpless. In the case of those working in medical frontlines, they have worried about what would happen if they paused to get treatment. They have seen cities and hospitals once under control come under siege again. Some have kept distant from their immediate families out of fear of accidentally killing them by spreading the disease. They worry about leaving a job that is too dangerous, but is the source of rent and food and health insurance. To have a chance of making it through these desperate times requires material and economic resources but also strong emotional supports, virtual and face-to-face. Building Stoic grit is not just a matter of inner toughness. It wasn't in ancient times. And it isn't now. Thank you for watching the Learner's Library. Please like, comment, and share. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon for more amazing audiobooks.